I busied myself by looking for a stiff bit of straw. "And how long have you known?" asked the Empress in waiting. "A year, perhaps." "And all the while you've let him ruin this empire, driving it to chaos?" "Pardon me, but I didn't see you marching across the dune plains and long sands to fetch him, and it's strange how such chaos should erupt the moment I leave the city, daughter." "That is their fault," Cecine hissed at Temsa and her grandmother. "I strongly recall being summoned to the piercer for a conversation all about chaos, Princess," said Temsa. "You got what you wanted, and what you deserve for all your scheming and double-crossing. Rich coming from a cultist like you." "Cultist?" Temsa's head spluttered. "They approached me, betrayed me in the end like everyone else." "You're the one who let them into the core districts once more, Cecine. But it is moot. Pharazar brought this upon himself the day he banished me. Isn't that right, son of mine? You two simply got in the way." Hirana growled, still staring at me. I evaded those white eyes. She constantly shuffled around, as if loathing the feeling of vapor instead of skin. Pharazar scoffed. "And gladly so, I say. Your cunning and ambition know no bounds, Cecine, and you, mother. Apparently not even the sky can hold you, it seems. I should have had you killed like father." "You could have tried." "Where is Etain, daughter?" Nilith asked. Cecine narrowed her eyes. "You don't call me that. You have no right. I raised myself." I saw Nilith flinch as that insult nicked a nerve. I'd found my piece of straw, and while I watched the bickering, I shuffled closer to the wall, clasped the lock, and began to waggle the straw in the simple lock. "And Etain is beyond the grave. Danib Ironjaw saw to that. Etain Talon proved himself a traitor in his last moments, though I bet you already knew that, seeing as he was your shade all along." "Somebody had to keep an eye on you." "I see I was wise to do so. What with the riots, Tals and Tors murdered en masse, and a Nyx water shortage of all things. How did you manage that?" "You want the throne, Cecine, but you're not fit to sit upon it. None of you are." "I'll fucking second that," said the foul-mouthed falcon, much to my surprise. Hirana rattled her chains. "And you are, Nilith? What has all this been for? Just so you can claim the throne for yourself?" "And what is that sorcery making you half alive, half shade?" Temsa demanded. "A long story is what it is, but it makes me more alive than any of you. Alive enough to take the throne and change Araxes for good." "She plans to set them free," Pharazar growled. "Every half-life." Laughter erupted from Temsa and Hirana. Cecine just boiled as if her entire future had just been reduced to cinders before her. Nilith sat straighter, enduring their mockery like a cliff endures the sea, though I could see in her eyes a weakness, a tiredness come from fighting too long, too hard, and for it all to come to naught in a sandstone cell. "Madness," cried Cecine. "Everything seems like madness when attempted for the first time, daughter," Nilith whispered. Hirana was outraged, her smashed face contorted with rage. "This is what you get for marrying a foreigner, Pharazar." "You would have murdered me anyway, mother." "He's the murderer," Hirana yelled at me. Silence fell as eyes turned on me. I answered it with a simple click of the lock. My manacles sprung free. "You're all murderers," I said calmly, though I wanted to shout it in every one of their faces. I didn't know whether it was the stress, the haunting, or the soldiers' clubs, but I felt broken, tired. "Every one of us. Even me. And I came to this city a thief, yes, but not a taker of lives. This city's changed me, just like it's changed and warped and corrupted all of you. You play this great game of yours even if it kills you, and yet you all lose in the end. Whether it's the knife, indenturement, banishment, or just simply forgetting what it's like to have a soul. Or humanity. You lose. None of you are innocent." "Thanks," said Pointy in my head. I met every one of their scowls even as I tackled the second lock. With the exception of the sword, he didn't really have a choice. The talking falcon? I don't know. "He's guilty, all right," muttered Cecine. "You are far, far from innocent. You can blame each other all you want, but look where it's got you. Dead, and in the dirt. You all play along because it gives you an excuse to be cruel and to do as you please. You breed hate and fear, celebrate callousness. Life has become worthless, not a miracle or magic, and nobody is given even a moment in the last 1,000 years to think whether things could or should change. None except this woman. They took a moment to stare at each other as I gestured to Nilith. The Empress kept her eyes on me as I broke open the second manacle and got to standing. It felt strangely good to look down on them all. Cecine tried to spit at me but forgot her ghostly form. By the way she shook, I wagered she was far from happy with it. I refused to be lectured by a crass thief who has never owned a soul in his life. The words, although malformed by her fresh binding, were damning enough. I threw up my hands in exasperation and pointed at Hirana, Cecine and Temza. As far as I'm concerned, you all got what was coming to you. Killed, chained up, captured by... I looked around, confused by the sunlight all of a sudden. Who's in charge? As if they'd had ears pressed up against the door, waiting for the perfect dramatic moment, the locks slid in their brackets, and in swept enlightened sisters Yaradine and Lyria. Gone were the monkish crimson robes, replaced instead by red cloaks. They wore dark steel breastplates etched with glyphs, kilts of mail, and greaves. Swords hid under the scarlet folds. I saw the tips of their scabbards. The sisters' bald heads were bare, their glow bright and their eyes shining. They didn't look victorious or magnanimous, but outraged. Lyria and Yaradine, if I'm not mistaken, muttered Nilith. It's been some time. Farazar growled. The very same. Release them, the sisters chorused, pointing to Nilith and me, though they quickly realized I'd already shed my manacles. I held my hands up as if they had a trigger bow trained on me. I had assumed my use to the cult was over now that the sanctuary was open, haunting or not. 3 ghosts in robes scuttled past them and quickly saw to Nilith's yoke and chains. We see no lock can keep you for long, Caltro, said Lyria, her face softening slightly. None ever has, I replied. Farazar seemed far from pleased to be left locked up, especially by the cult. Release me, sisters! I am your emperor, he yelled. You are no emperor, Farazar, Yaradine told him, looking down on him like a child might look at a bug before squashing it. You have not been for some time, if you ever were. Outrageous! Filthy cultists, said Cecine. They've been behind all this, I know it. Played us both, Temza muttered. He seemed subdued, almost defeated in that moment. Perhaps my words had finally got into that disembodied skull of his. I found it ironic how much they hated each other, yet were bonded by their hatred of the cult. It could have been useful, had they ever had the wits to put their minds together. Correct, Tor, Empress-in-waiting. A starving person will do much for a morsel, and you two were hungry indeed. The ghosts came with red robes and draped them over both Nilith's shoulders and mine. Careful now, Caltro. Showing your true colours. Hirana narrowed her skewed eyes at me as the sisters and Nilith left the room. I ignored her, looking to Pointy instead. His pommel stone wore a deep frown. My sword? I called after them. The sisters eyed me from the corridor, measuring me, assessing my intent. They nodded as one, and I reached for Pointy, turning him against his own rope. The threads split at the merest touch of his metal, and the falcon on the floor breathed a sigh of relief. Thank fuck for that, he said, closing his eyes. The heavy door closed with a bang and a crunch of bolts behind us, and we found ourselves in a corridor that had a faint and constant rumble to it. The sunlight was gone, replaced by the familiar ghostly glow of lanterns filled with fluttering insects. The other ghosts withdrew to the ends of the corridor while Lyria and Yaradine stayed with us. Nilith stood apart from us, shoulders heavy with burden, but eyes sharp and awake with suspicion. Our sincerest apologies, Empress. Our brothers and sisters were too eager in their attempts to make sure you were safe. You were not meant to be treated so harshly. You are our esteemed guests, and as Mr. Basalt can testify, we treat our guests with the utmost respect. I shrugged, unable to deny them, but eager to get to the point. Where is my half-coin? Neither of the sisters looked at me as they spoke. All in good time, Caltro. Wait. 3 questions, sisters, Nilith said, holding up 3 glowing fingers. The rest of her arm stayed hidden under her robe. Ask away, Empress, though we... Where are we? Beneath the avenue of Oshirim, in Catra-Rasan, That rumbling you can hear is the streets above. The cathedral, on its head. Pharazar always suspected, whispered Nilith, understanding the Arctian. Where is Pharazar's body? Safe, below us in a sealed chamber that only we have the key to. And where is my horse? Also safe, above in our stables, quite the animal, extraordinarily protective. I wondered how many ghosts had been kicked across the plaza before the cult had managed to subdue a Noish. Nilith cleared her throat and began to walk away down the corridor. You may show me to both, and then you may escort me to the Grand Nixwell to claim Pharazar's body, she said. Interfere and face the consequences. Have I mentioned how much I admire her? Pointy commented in my head. The sisters had not moved. We plan to do nothing of the sort. Do you not? Whose soldiers and ghosts apprehended us at the Nixwell? Cecine's forces, unaware of the shift, shall we say, in power. Nilith stopped. Whose power? The sisters smiled. Won't you walk with us, Empress? Nilith was far from convinced. She put a hand to her hip as if reaching for a sword handle, but realized she was unarmed. Her fists clenched in any case. We know your time is short. Please, a small amount of your time might be worthwhile. On one condition. Yes, Empress? I know the old ways of healing with Nyx water and the touch of a ghost. I witnessed it firsthand in a batway. I want you to heal the falcon. Lyria and Yaradine shared a look. Empress, they said, we found the falcon bezel beside the body of your daughter. He was the one who... I'm very aware of what he did, Nilith said, a crack in her voice. Heal him. He's had enough pain. Yaradin raised a hand to one of the nearby ghosts while Lyria led us forwards into a stairwell and through a network of ever-burrowing tunnels and steps. The Caltro Basalt seemed to be a hive of busyness that day. At junctions, in the corridors, teams of shades and handcarts passed us by, their loads covered in scarlet tarpaulins. Every chamber I glimpsed was host to some sort of activity or another, filled from wall to door with ghosts and red-robed living. Nilith stared about, as baffled as I was by the hustle and bustle, and curious how large the cathedral was. Her gaze didn't stop roving. Lyria stayed silent until she brought us to a wider corridor with an open end. Another rumble filled my ears, though this wasn't from above but below. It grew louder as we approached the twisted iron railings of a wooden walkway and became a dull roar as we emerged. Gusts of air disturbed my vapours, made my robes flap around my legs. Sunlight from above cast veils of spiralling dust motes. Below us was a glowing sea of ghosts and red cloth. They were stacked on every level of the cathedral's deep pit. Crowds of cultists flowed like purple rivers around ramps and stairwells and walkways, cascading down each level like waterfalls. Many simply waited, shuffling about as they conversed. Many others still worked away at their frantic errands. I leaned out over the iron railing and felt dizzy staring into their depths. Welcome, Empress, to the Church of Sesh, Sister Lyria said softly, barely audible over the roar of the crowds. Nilith began to chuckle, softly at first, then a loud laugh that echoed through the giant rafters of the cathedral's roof. All this time we've been fighting amongst ourselves, and you've been building your own empire under our noses. You were right, Caltro. This has all been for naught. On the contrary, Empress, this has all been for peace. This is all for you. Lies. We see Caltro hasn't told you of our intentions. I crossed my arms. Oh, he has. He told me it was the cult that orchestrated much of this chaos, that it's Cecine you plan to put on the throne, not me. Lyria sighed, placing her hands on the railing as Nilith had. She followed her gaze down into the crowds. We're not so different, you and the cult. Though we have alternate methods, we strive for the same result. And that is? Peace, justice, and freedom for all. We too believe the Empire sick, and its poison is indenturement. The code, the tenets. We recognize the system is broken, Empress, and people like Temsa, Hirana, and with respect your daughter, are content to keep it broken. We want to heal it, as you do. But you worship chaos. We worship the god of death, of change. Chaos is but Sesh's tool. Lyria turned to face the Empress, and Nilith met her gaze. We tried many years ago when you were but fresh to the Ark, barely Emperor in waiting, Farazar's wife. We had hoped to breed the idea of freedom in Milazan, but your husband thwarted us, drove us out. For 2 decades we have watched Farazar drive the Empire into decline, waiting for an opportunity not for revenge, but for change. The Church of Sesh trades in information, and after gathering all our knowledge together, we knew another ruler was needed. We originally chose you, Empress. According to our spies, you've never been the Arctian that Farazar expected, riling against every code and tenet that stood in your way. We had planned to help you ascend to the throne, but when you disappeared, Empress, our plans changed. Like the rest of the city, we believed you had fled back to Kras, finally tired of your inept husband. We knew your ambitious daughter would make a move on his sanctuary and that she longed to make a name for herself. We assumed, perhaps wrongly, that her ambition could be used for good, and so, through Attain, we introduced her to the only person in Araxes with ambition enough to match hers. Boss Boran Temza. He had not only the ambition but the means. As with many other soul-stealers, such as Berix the Pale or Astarte, we've been watching Temza for years. We placed Danib with him when he began to show promise and a thirst for climbing Araxes' ladder. We used that thirst, providing him tours and towels with private vaults, showing Cecine that with enough uproar she could draw Farazar from his sanctuary and emerge the saviour of the city. She took our example to heart, and the pressure in the city rose to boiling point. We knew Cecine and Temza would clash eventually, becoming rivals instead of partners. Such minds can never work well with others. By creating a villain in Temza, we were able to deliver him to Cecine as a gift, giving her a scapegoat she could use to play the hero she longed to be, and patching the rift Farazar put between the city and the cult. Lyria paused, and I found myself nodding appreciatively. Nilith was content to listen. I could almost hear the cogs of her sharp mind working. For all our years of careful planning, we did not account for several rogue factors, Lyria continued, holding up 3 glowing fingers of her own. A vengeful grandmother every Arctian thought banished or dead. The Reach's finest locksmith, murdered his first night in Araxes. Both women looked at me, and I find myself trying to suck in my gut. And you, Nilith Reichar, a wife who would kill her husband and drag his body hundreds of miles home. Lyria sighed thoughtfully. You've fought hard, haven't you, Empress? Nilith couldn't help but agree, or so her slumping shoulders and weary blink told me. The question remains, who will ascend to the throne? There was a tense pause until Lyria broke it. Who would you choose? A rampant soul-stealer thirsty for power and blood, still trying to prove his young self right? A cruel old woman too consumed with vengeance to remember trust and loyalty? A daughter so full of hate she would ruin an empire just to appear its saviour? Or a woman who would cross a desert twice with the Emperor's body, fighting to heal the corruption of a city that's not even hers? I knew which I'd choose. I could see why these sisters called themselves enlightened. They made a damn fine argument. Whether tongue-tied, tired, or simply waiting for the answer, Nilith stared at the sisters long and hard. We would choose the latter, answered Yaradin, emerging from the mouth of the corridor to stare down into the masses. You are Farazar's rightful killer. The city will not accept any claim but yours, especially given the fact any other candidates are now dead and bound. We can help you take the throne, and you will be free to make the changes you have fought to make. Perhaps their ears had been pressed to the door after all. Lyria stepped closer. We know what you intend to do with your authority, Empress. To bring freedom to Shades. It's been a dream of the Church's for an age, and we will gladly stand beside you upon the dais of the Grand Nixwell. You forget this. Nilith held up her left fist, shrugging the robe and rags along her arm and casting sapphire light across the balcony's iron and wood. With her fingers she dragged away her ragged collar, where blue vapour had now claimed most of the skin of her chest. It was now clawing its way up her neck, the brown of her skin turning to ash and charcoal where life crossed into death. "And you forget this," said Lyria, reaching for Nilith's other hand. Sand, blood, chip nails and all. Nilith shrugged away but got the sister's meaning. "Though there is no cure we can offer you. The Slathergast poison hasn't claimed you yet. There's still time. Half alive is better than half dead, is that it?" Nilith spat. Yaradine conceded with a nod. "In the eyes of the City of Countless Souls, yes. So I'm your last choice." "No." Lyria shook her head resolutely. "You are our last hope. The city teeters on the edge of ruin. The Nyx has all but dried up. Order has been abandoned. Justice is a long-lost memory. The time is short for it to be saved. It will require sacrifice, but worthy sacrifice." The words fell heavy between us. I would have bowed under such responsibility, but Nilith straightened, looking down her nose at the sisters as if spectacles balanced on its tip. It was the most imperious I'd ever seen the woman, and I saw the Empress in her rise to the challenge. "And here I was expecting to have to fight my way out of a cult of Sesh dungeon," she said. "We prefer Church of Sesh, Empress, and we would rather be an ally than an enemy," Yaradine said, wearing that thin sister's smile, cold and empty, but a smile nonetheless. "Will you let us help you achieve what you want?" asked Lyria, staring deep into Nilith's emerald eyes, searching them eagerly. It took the Empress some time to answer, her gaze locked on the sisters. "I will," Nilith said at last. "But the gods, Caltro, the flood!" Pointy reminded me, deep in the recesses of my mind, as if he feared the sisters would hear him even within my skull. Perhaps he was right. Lyria turned to look at me, beckoning as Yaradine led Nilith along the walkway. A series of zigzags in and out of the earthen walls brought us to a set of stairs leading to a long drawn-out platform. Suspended by a series of golden chains, it thrust out into space, almost to the centre of the great pit that was the cathedral on its head. The sheer breadth of space between the flimsy wooden cladding of the platform and the glowing depths dizzied me, and I had fallen from the tip of the greatest spire known to humanity. "Farazar will fucking love this," Nilith said, adopting a weary smile. "What now?" she asked. For once, the sisters held their tongues and simply gestured to the empty platform. Nilith took a step forward, realized I hadn't moved, and waved a hand for me to follow. I wanted to gulp. I stayed where I was, unable to help craning my neck to peer over the edges of the walkway, like a morbid urge to run your finger along the knife, just to test its edge. "Caltro," Nilith beckoned to me again, and I did as I was told. I followed closely behind her, nervous and unavoidably mindful of the last royal I had teetered on the edge of a great height with. Nilith strode out before me, as if this was the very least of the challenges she had faced in the Ark's deserts. I wondered if they would make my tribulations as pale as sun-bleached papyrus. I had no choice but to join her at the strict, bare edge of the platform, where we leaned over to feel the cold draughts of air swirling up the jumbled tiers of Katra-Rasan. Before we had realized their presence, Lyria and Yaradine called out from behind us as one. I almost tumbled over in shock. "Presenting the new ruler absolute of the Arctian Empire, Empress Nilith Rykar Renala." The roar that filled the cathedral was so thunderous, I half expected the rafters and sunlight to come crashing down. Swathes of ghosts fell to their knees like fields of corn bending before the oncoming storm. Those wearing breastplates or bearing shields beat their swords against their metal, giving an avid heartbeat to the massed crowds of dead. As they swayed and bellowed, they became one great beast hungry for action. "Finally, we shall have our freedom! Sesh be praised!" The sisters chorused, their words echoing around the chamber and bringing the voices to deafening levels. I watched as Nilith raised her hands to the crowds, drinking in their praise and cheers like a warlord atop a conquered castle. I watched her wide eyes flit about the masses, watching them bow and punch the air with their fists. Perhaps not the victorious moment she had imagined deep beneath the earth with the fanatics of the cult. But she had earned it. As the roaring continued unabated, Lyria and Yaradine led us back to the shadow of the walkway. Tomorrow, Nilith, you will stand at the Grand Nixwell. The church will make sure of it, said the sisters, shouting over the noise. The last stores of Nyx water are being prepared to refill the well. Chamberlain Rabin has already been informed of your return. The Chamber of Code stands with you, as do the shade soldiers Cicene put upon the streets, and the brothers and sisters of the cult are at your disposal. Nilith bowed her head. For now, you may rest, added Yaradine. Ghosts appeared unbidden from a nearby archway of sandstone red as their robes. Our brothers and sisters will lead the way. As the ghosts gathered about her, Nilith cast me a look over her shoulder. Maybe it's time to stop running, she called to me, with a grim nod. No sooner had the ghosts appeared than they vanished into the warren of Catro-Rasan, and I was left alone with the sisters, one hovering at each of my shoulders. I would listen to her, brother, breathed Lyria, standing so close, her cold vapour mingled with mine. 3 times you have run from us now. We would find it hard to accept a 4th. What was I supposed to do? You bargained with me like a pawn when you wanted the sanctuary open. Where is my half-coin? I asked, not moving, not turning, just staring at some grimy spot on the iron railings under my glowing hand. The words had barely escaped my mouth before I found it dangling beside my cheek on a clean chain of silver and copper thread. The faint lanterns above us gave it a greenish hue. I snatched it away, praying for the metal not to burn me, but all I felt was its faint weight, and the dull cold sitting in my palm. Relief flowed through me like a breeze. So what now? I asked them, turning to challenge their blank expressions. What do you need of me? Lyria looked somewhat offended. Nothing. You're free to do as you wish, Caltro, as any of our brothers and sisters are. You may leave Araxes, if you please. We will even have a ship prepared. Now there were some enchanting words I had longed to hear. However, we hope you will stay. Join us at the Grand Nixwell. Be a part of our revolution, said Yaradine, words soft and sticky like cold honey. Stand with us in the Empress tomorrow and watch justice come to the city of countless souls. I looked between them. The pieces had been swept from the board. Only they and the Empress remained. For all intents and purposes, they had finally won. Royal backing. No challengers. Freedom in sight, and yet I couldn't help but rack my brains to figure their angle, their cut, their play. I jabbed a thumb over my shoulder. You convinced Nilith easily enough, but I have no stake in the Ark. My fight's over now. I'd quite like to go home. You promised, Caltro. You wouldn't stand with your brothers and sisters? Lyria stated, making it sound accusatory. Once again she spoke my thoughts before I could. Do you not trust us? It's not that I don't trust you. We have given the Empress what she wants, what the city wants. Yaradine stepped closer, eyes narrow, appearing hurt. Have we not given you the same kindness? Given you justice? She tapped the half-coin in my palm. Your freedom? You have, but I daren't even think of the gods' warnings in case the sisters saw it in my mind. Lyria spoke in my ear. We would make you a king amongst the dead, Caltro Basalt. That stumped me. What do you mean, a king? A king? You? Really? Pointy piped up. I covered his face with my hand. Lies! We told you before, Caltro. A new era is coming and its dawn is tomorrow. Lyria smiled. If you must be shown, then we will show you. Perhaps once you see, you will finally trust us, and stand with your brothers and sisters at the Nixwell. Before I knew it, the enlightened sisters were guiding me along the walkway unusually forcibly. Their mail jingled furiously with their hurried pace. They marched me to a lift, one with thick cogs intruding on every wall, and with the shuffling of some levers, the cogs began to turn, dropping down into a black shaft. Not a word was said during our jittering descent. Pointy was quiet for the most part, despite several overbearing coughing noises and muttered warnings about rabbit holes. I busied myself thumbing the face of my half-coin, trying and failing to feel the ridges of a glyph that was not my name. If I ever made it out of the cult's shadow, I would carve Caltro across it. When the archway of a corridor rose up to greet us, a yank of the lever stopped us dead, and we began to wind through knotted stairwells and halls, propped up by thick, cubic pillars. Beyond and below those halls, we came to an iron-plated door adorned with glyphs I had never seen before. This door had no locks, but simply weight and heavy bars to keep it closed. The sisters pressed their hands against twin lines of glyphs, and the bars began to recede of their own accord. I got the feeling this wasn't going to be the most bizarre portion of the day. Old hinges whined as the room beyond was revealed. From what I could see, the room was a bare box of polished stone tiles. I felt a draught of heat against my vapours, as if the trapped air was desperate to escape. The tails of my borrowed robe billowed. "We must leave your sword here," said Yaradine, fingers already around Pointy's handle. Though I flinched away, she relieved me of him and hung him from 2 pins in the wall. "Why?" My nervousness was growing. "Come," Lyria said, her hand pressed into the small of my back. The word "cell" flitted through my mind. I cursed myself for not being my usual charming self. I blamed my nightmare. The only feature in the room was a circular stone construction, the height of my waist. Radiant coals lay atop it, trapped beneath a slab of seamless granite and yet somehow still burning. A dusting of black sand had been cast across the slab. The whole lump of stone looked half forge, half altar. "The age of the living is over, Caltro," said the sisters in unison. "The age of the dead is beginning." The door had swung closed. I couldn't feel the soul blade in my mind anymore. Black smoke began to eke from the coals, dripping down the side of the altar forge. Lyria spoke alone, voice rising in pitch as though she were being squeezed. "Nilith's ascent to the throne is just the spark to a flame that will change this world once more." Now Yaradine, "We will usher in a new peace, a new empire. One united under the master who gave us our half-lives." Black sand began to pour out of unseen holes in the granite slab, swirling in breezes I couldn't feel. The smoke began to rise, filling the air about us. The coals flared once, spitting flame and then darkened to a ruby glow. For the first time since being dead, I felt a warmth in me, and not one of a scorching sun. "Prepare yourself, Caltro. It's not every day you meet a god." How I fought not to correct them. Instead, I stared into the pile of sand before me, writhing as though worms duelled beneath the black grains. Just as I was about to ask what this mystical pile was, the sand built itself into a tower, a crude model of the cloud piercer. Before it reached the tip, the sand fell apart. If a snake could speak and was choking as it breathed, it would sound like the voice that filled the silence. "Caltro Basalt," it said, its hissing echoing through the smoke. "Sesh, I presume. We have met before," I replied, wishing I could see the look on the sisters' faces. A grinning wolf appeared in the sand, rolling back and forth across the granite slab, as if it shook its head at me. "You doubt me," came a great exhale. The wolf collapsed into itself, and 2 robed and hooded sisters rose from the sand instead. Where their eyes should be, the sand glowed hot as if lava flowed within it. "Doubt my children." "I do," I said. I felt my lips quivering, as if Sesh were trying to drag the words out of me. The sand became restless, thrashing back and forth, drawing faces I didn't recognize. "Lies, you've been told. Countless lies." I've been told so many that every word is starting to sound like a lie at the moment. Enough. I was brought here to be shown the truth. Let's see it. I heard the sisters' slight gasp at my bluntness to their living, breathing, smouldering deity. Waves ran across the sand pile, crackling with sparks. "Backbone. Excellent. Something many of my children lack." But they were correct. "You will do well amongst us. Give me your hand, thief." Black sand reached up, belching smoke as a palm and fingers formed. I wrinkled my lip. Self-preservation might have been my religion, but curiosity had always been my ruler. It was too late to change that now. The final question of the flood had to be answered. I thrust out my hand, and the god of chaos took it willingly. Black grit swarmed over my blue vapours like the tentacles of an octopus, drawing me down and to my knees. Sunlight flooded the smog-filled room. I stumbled onto my knees, feeling the dry warmth of stone beneath me. White sand scattered around my glowing toes, unhurried and playful. I blinked in the brightness, making out a plaza of stone stretching out into the distance, where tall spires were wrapped in smoke and lacked detail. Shadows swung across the bleached stone, tracing the shapes of dark claws. I raised my head to see tusks towering above me. Where they breached the earth, I saw a queen-like figure standing upon a dais, and she was translucent and turquoise in the sun's glare, raising a half-moon of copper to an endless crowd of dead. As I staggered to my feet, feeling the world slip beneath me, I called out, hearing nothing but an echo amongst the buildings. In a blink, the queen had turned to me. Her hand reached over the dust and stone to take mine, and I felt the sun's light grow brighter. I stood with her upon the dais of marble and looked out over the faceless multitudes. Outlines they were, and nothing more, sketches of flowing blue, but they raised their hands to me all the same, and cheered with undrawn mouths. I felt the weight of metal on my forehead and saw the glint of gold at the corner of my eyes. Lifting my gaze, I saw the queen with a crown upon her head, taller than a spear. Again, I heard the voices of the dead, watched the crowd prostrate themselves before me. I looked over them, a lord in an empire that wasn't my own, and as I looked beyond the glow of the crowds where the sun turned the flagstones to light, I saw the bodies filling every inch of stone across the plaza, and the lone red star hanging in the pale sky. Heat seared my hand, wrenching me from the sunlight and back to the smoggy room. The altar forge before me was still belching smoke. "Stand with us, Saviour!" The sand writhed back and forth, forming the mandibles of an insect, then the pointy ears of a jackal before collapsing. To the breath of a prolonged whisper, the sand drained away into the granite slab, and the lava glow of the coals faded. I looked up to find Lyria and Yaradin standing over me. With the scuffing of sand, I got to my feet and brushed my robes free. They spoke in turn, voices almost sing-song. "Our secrets have been laid bare, Caltro. Your decision? Stand with your brothers and sisters, reap the rewards of the new era, or fade back to Crass, forgotten?" I shifted towards the doorway, and they trailed me, waiting, watching me like a wolf watches a rabbit hole. They must have assumed me dazed or humbled. The door was shut behind me, and the bars retreated back into the stone arch at their own idle pace. Keeping my silence, I took Pointy from the wall and slid him back into my rags. "Caltro?" "Thank you for showing me the truth," I whispered, facing away from the ghosts that hovered behind me. "Tomorrow, sisters." "Tomorrow, brother." And there I left the sisters, alone in the dark tiled corridor. I left them there to stare at each other and share a smile between themselves.
Yaradin sighed as she watched the locksmith disappear around a corner. She sounded weary. "Do you think he trusts us now, sister?" Lyria did nothing so perceptible as nod. "If anything is true of Caltro Basalt, it is that he is incapable of making decisions for himself. He is a magpie hungry for silver, and we have just shown him gold. He will join us, if only for the convenience." "And if not?" Yaradin mused. With the clink and thud of chainmail and steel-plated boots, Danib lumbered into view, his new greatsword Perisef leaning casually against his shoulder as if it were no more dangerous or heavy than an umbrella. The vapour snaking from between the plates of the Shade's battle armour had a heavy mix of white amongst the blue, One arm hung limply, and he seemed to list towards his left side. The duel with Atane had cost him. "Caltros is not the only soul blade in the city," said Yaredin. "Then we proceed." Yaredin extended a hand, and Lyria took it, vapours entwining. "Indeed we do, sister." "Let us take the city, brother Daneb." Daneb growled like a storm on the horizon. Chapter 24. A Night of 1,000 Knives. Dune worms, though fearsome, are supposedly poor imitations of their ancestors. The nomads still trade tales of dune dragons, creatures so large they could swallow entire caravans in one ravenous gulp. These beasts had hides like mountain slopes, could spit fire, and the beating of their wings was known to blow sandstorms across the plains. Even today, many nomads believe that storms come from the last dragons beating their wings. How confident are we in our learning and the reach of our empire that we can know with absolute certainty these are merely stories, and that wild and ancient powers don't still lurk on the borders of our knowledge? From The Youth of Man by Esper Drac. Chamberlain Rabene picked a crumb from the corner of his eye while he tested the limits of his lungs. Once he'd crammed as much breath as he could into his ribcage, Rabene let his head loll against the back of his chair and exhaled. As the air left him, he deflated into his cushions, sagging like a squeezed wineskin. It felt as if the weeks of collar-tugging and sweating, of heart palpitations, of yelling and screaming, both at him and by him, were, for now, behind him. There might have been a Nyx drought, a smoking cloud piercer, and a city on the verge of collapse, but they were tomorrow's problems. At that moment, tomorrow was a year away. Rabene picked at the unravelled message once again, flicking it with a finger to turn its papyrus to face him. He had read the glyphs 10 times since it had been delivered, not by Atane as he would have expected, but by a speechless cultist in a faded rose robe. The shade had left quickly, leaving behind a single scroll. "Nilith is claiming the throne on the morrow." The Chamberlain chuckled to himself loudly. It sounded odd in the emptiness of his vaulted hall, unpractised. Perhaps it had been too long since anything but worry and anger had come out of his mouth. It was good to laugh again. And what a joke it was. Rabene scanned the glyphs once more, making sure. Empress Nilith had returned to Araxes, and with none other than Emperor Pharazar in tow, dead and glowing and ready to be bound. As he breathed another sigh, Rabene wished he hadn't tucked tail and fled the moment the roof had caved in. He wished he could have been there to see the cheated looks on Cicene and old Empress Hirana's faces when they found the sanctuary empty as a beggar's purse. It must have been such a joyous moment, but Rabene had only his imagination to entertain him. Even so, it brought a wide grin to his face. Cicene deserved to be cheated so. Rabene had always liked the Empress, admired her even. Though their paths had crossed little, Rabene had always noticed an unnecessary kindness in her. Even though it might only be the bid of a good day, it was foreign enough to Araxes and always appreciated. But oh, how she had proven herself to be as cunning as any Arctian. It was the last move he would have expected from her, and that was why it was brilliant. Rabene reached for the scroll, rolling it back and forth across the desk in different directions, furling and unfurling it. Hope was a fickle beast. It had been so long since he'd dared to feel it, he didn't recognize its touch at first. What a day tomorrow will be, "Scribe!" barked the chamberlain. He listened to the echoes bounce about the room as he waited, stifling a yawn. "Useless woman," Rebene said to himself, drumming his fingers on his desktop. "Scribe! Get in here! It's late, and I wish to go home!" To the chamberlain, it felt as though sleep was an old habit, long shrugged off and stamped out. Tiredness already clawed at him. "Scribe!" Rebene arose from the cushions and stalked around the expansive breadth of his desk. The throbbing in his head, the one that had at long last begun to die away, resurged. "Come tomorrow, I will find myself a new assistant, one that doesn't fall asleep at their post or fail me in every way, shape and form." Rebene's tirade sputtered out as one half of the tall oak doors creaked open. In its gap stood his scribe. The chamberlain didn't think it possible, but the woman's glazed-over eyes had become even more distant. The scribe seemed to look through Rebene rather than at him. "Useless! Finally, dead gods, woman, I want you to dispatch a note to all magistrates, scrutinizers, and proctors that they are to assemble in the Grand Nixwell," he said, pacing back and forth. "The new Empress will need our support. Let us show this city the Chamber of the Code isn't dead yet, and is far from the toothless wolf they believe it to be. And find me Hellis, damn it! Boren Temsa is dead and bound. What could she possibly be? Are you listening to me, woman?" Hands upon hips, Rebene stared at the scribe, trying to find so much as a reflection in her glassy gaze. As he stared, a drip of bright blood pooled in the corner of her mouth, hovered as it swelled, and then dribbled down her chin. 2 drips pattered on the flagstones and spread like blossoming roses. Without so much as a gurgle, the scribe's glazed eyes rolled up, and she pitched forwards into the chamberlain's office. A black-clad shade stood behind her, his glow wrapped up in leather and ashen mail. He wore no expression, and all he held in his hand was a curved and bloody knife. Behind him, matching shades stood over corpses of guards and proctors. Rebene could hear screams echoing along the corridors. The chamberlain began to sweat profusely. "Guards! Scrutinizers! Anyone!" called Rebene, retreating as fast as his long robes and flimsy golden sandals would allow. He stumbled once, only to scramble upright and flee for his desk, where a sword lay wedged in a compartment. "What is the meaning of this?" screeched Rebene as he ran, all hope demolished, all humour trampled. He could almost see his bright future catch light at its edges and begin to burn, blacken and curl into ash. "Who are you? I don't understand! Temsa is dead!" As he fled, Rebene looked back at the impassive blue face behind him, not chasing him, just keeping pace. The shade's knife left a trail of blood drops. Other half-lives now stood at the door, waiting, watching. Chamberlain Rebene reached his desk with ragged breaths. He sprawled across it, half mounting it in his desperate attempt to escape. He grabbed the scroll in his panic, but no sooner had his sweat-slick fingers grasped its cylinder did he feel the blade puncture his shoulder, then his ribs, again and again. Retching with pain, Rebene slumped across the mahogany of his desk, watching his own blood pool around him, dyeing his cream silken robes a dark crimson. He could hear it dripping on the stone. As the lights of his chamber were snuffed, Rebene gasped his last breaths and ran a shaking thumb across the glyphs of the scroll, staining them with blood. "To have endangered our family in such a way, our proud name, this bank, I can't even look at you!" Rasen Fennec bowed his head to his father, cheeks afire. He furiously thumbed the sleeve of his golden grey silk robes, annoyed at how easily the fabric slipped over itself. He wanted to slip away just as easily, away from his father's furious face. The death of Temsa had been a relief to many, Russin imagined, but to none more so than him. The sharp and heavy blade that had dangled over his son's, his wife, and his own head had been removed. He was not ashamed to say he had wept at the news of the Empress's return and the capture and binding of Tor Boran Temsa. However, it seemed even in death, Temsa was intent on cursing Russin. Punishment for trespassing against the code and his father. Unfair punishment, so Russin thought. "I had no choice, father. I have told you again and again." "You should have spoken to me. The chamber would have—" "Temsa bade me not to speak a word. He would have killed Bilzar and Helen and Haria. What then?" "How dare you interrupt me?" Tor Fenwick bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. His temper ran so hot, his face had gone beyond crimson and was now a shade of beetroot. Russin threw up his hands, bursting from the chair to pace around the room, trying to calm himself with walking. "Once the Empress takes the throne, normality will resume, as will investigations. The chamber will want to know how Temsa climbed so high, why we weighed him. Do you know how many of his half-coins we have stacked in our vaults? How many investments built upon them? Don't you see, boy? This will ruin us!" "Don't call me boy!" Russin Fenwick snapped. "I'm well aware how many bloody coins we have in the vaults. I'm the sigil, after all. I forged the transfers." Tor Fenwick was unused to hearing his son shout back. He took a controlled breath, pressed his fingertips to the desk, and spread them out cage-like. He narrowed his sage-coloured eyes at Russin and chewed his lip and moustache for some time until he reached his decision. "I will not stand to see Fenwick's coinery soiled by soul-stealing barbarians like Boran Temsa, or fools like you putting your peasant wife and bastard children ahead of this proud name. I gave you a tower, a career, hoping you would prove yourself. But I have been proved wrong," Fenwick growled. In his pause, his face grew blank, impassive, devoid of any emotion. This was not family anymore, but business. Such was the casual savagery of the banking district. Even sons and daughters could become debtors. As the saying went in Oshiram district, copper was thicker than blood. "You will take the blame for this travesty. You broke the code, an errant sigil blackmailed by a soul-stealer. I trust the chamber will have mercy on you," said Fenwick, the only hint of emotion a stumble in his voice. He bowed his head. "You have no idea what you've done to this family." Russin ripped the sleeves of his robe. "No. If anything, I've saved my family. That's all that matters to me now." Leaving his father to swipe a fist at a nearby stack of half-coins and scrolls, Russin kicked his way out of the office door and strode across the mirror-like marble. His reflection was dark with the lack of lanterns. 4 sleepy sigils still toiled atop their tall towers, heads bowed or wiping dribble from their lips at the noise. 4 accompanying guards came to attention. A purple-faced Tor Fenwick appeared at his doorway. "Don't you walk away from me, Russin Fenwick!" he screamed, jolting the other sigils violently awake. Before he reached the grand steps to the ground floor, Russin turned, opened his bare arms wide, and gave his father an ambivalent wave. His face was thunder, but he stayed silent. "Don't you dare!" A mighty crash cut rudely through Fenwick's shout. Glass and splinters and stone dust filled the lower level as 2 battering rams breached the doors. Before Russin could take a breath, dozens of shades in russet armour and crimson cloaks flowed through the wreckage. Short swords and short spears in hand, they fell upon the ranks of house guards struggling to form up. As dozens became 100, it took mere moments for the shades to mount the stairs. With a scream, the sigil was enveloped like a rock in a stormy high tide, as blades pierced him, cut ribbons from him. Before he was lost in the silent, murderous crowd, Russin held his father's gaze. Even then his father was a coward, backing into his office in jittering increments, half frozen from shock. "My family is safe," Russin told himself over and over, as the cold, vaporous feet trampled his corpse, and he descended into a world of black water. Annie Jezebel slammed her palm on the pitted wood of the bar top, making several nearby patrons jump and then shuffle away, stools squeaking. Starson appeared from somewhere behind the bar with a fresh tankard of a beer that was vaguely green and had a head on it like a snowcap. His pale face was smeared with black grease. "This'll help drown them sorrows, boss. Aged Volcal from the Bleedhorn back home in Skull. Proper northern beer." "So fucked, Starson," Annie grumbled, slowly grinding her studded knuckle into the sticky wood. "It's not sorrow. Temsa got what he deserved. Fell from the tower he built with his own hands. You didn't see how close he came to madness. I did him a favour, in truth." "So you said, boss." Annie looked up at the smudged mirror and at the smattering of patrons that occupied the Rusty Slab Tavern. 24 were scattered across the tables, some in clumps, others drinking alone. A single bard with an argyle in a far corner did his best to lighten the mood with scraping ditties and old favourites, but it turned out to be too heavy to lift. Annie didn't blame them. Cultists had been seen on the streets throughout the day, proclaiming the return of Empress Nilith and a great gathering at the Grand Nixwell on the morrow. The city had begun to peer out of its doors and shutters, but the locks were still in place. The great murderer Temsa had been brought to justice. The Empress had returned, but the Nixwater shortage remained, and according to the hushed whispers and beggar talk, that shortage had dwindled to a complete lack. Riots had been seen roaming the sprawls. A Nixwell had been destroyed. The city of countless souls still tiptoed along a cliff edge. Annie felt it constantly, like prickly hair stuck in her collar. She had barely let go of her axe since leaving Boone's tower. Even now, the hand that wasn't wrapped around her beer was strangling the axe handle. "So fucked," she said, swilling the Volcal around. Rarely had she been a drinker. A woman like her had too many enemies to dally with drunkenness. And now the cult have Temsa, and Caltro, and Cicene and that bitch Horrocks by the looks of it. The Cloudpiercer had smoked for almost a day now. Talk of a flying machine had spread like house fires. "Something's got to snap, Starson," she sighed. "This next drought." The nearby patrons grumbled at her words. A sharp look from Annie sent them shuffling even further, right to a table by the wall. "I wish I could swing an axe through Araxes and put it out of its misery, like I did the boss. The old boss, not the Tory he pretended to be, the noble he desperately wanted to be," Annie said, slamming her hand down again. She cursed Temsa for changing. Scratching a living is better than slaving in death. He was wrong. Our kind can claim all the coins we want. We'll still never be noble. It's in the breed and bearing, like they can smell their own blood. You can pretend all you want, but you become a husk. Better to be born noble or not at all. That's what I've heard them say. That's the fucking wall they've built, and they've built it strong and high. No ladder, tunnel, ram or army's going to break it any time soon. Starson watched her angry eyes flit about, looking for something to break or squish. He too had poured himself a mug of Volcal. A lime-green moustache of foam clung to his thin lip. He bared his blackened teeth as he gasped. "Ah, that's the shit. Right there," he sighed. "And you ain't wrong. 1,000 years and nothing's changed yet. If it works for the rich, then it must work for all, Temsa once told me, just after he took me on as a sellsword." Starson was staring down into his mug. "You miss the North, boss?" he asked, raising his green beer. Annie thought back to the wind-swept beaches and black rocky crags of her youth, to fighting fellow children with sticks and always winning. It was simpler. "And stop calling me that. I'm not the boss." "Well, who the fuck else is?" Starson said. He was right. Almost every surviving sellsword fled Boone and Gore's towers the first moment they could. Annie was left with the old-timers, like Starson and a handful of soldiers too lazy to find another job. The barman was scratching at the octopus tattoo that covered his neck. Some sort of red rash had broken out. He beckoned, drawing her closer. "Come here. You've got Temsa's half-coins, shades, has tavern, noble or not, boss of nobody maybe, but Jezebel, you ain't scratching no fucking living." She looked at her green beer, letting its sulphurous whiff tickle her nose. "We got Lodocks captains that owe us favours," she suggested. "What you thinking?" "I'm thinking we get the fuck out of Araxes while we still can." "North!" Annie drained her tankard, and with a thump, she put her boots to the boards and got to standing. There was a slight wobble, but she stayed upright and showed off a rare grin. Starson matched it with his tar-black teeth. "We go to the Scatter Isles, my home. We visit Fenwick's coinery in the morning, get that sigil Russin to sell all Temsa's coins. Then we all take what we can carry and board the first ship to Harris." Annie sighed, deep and long, patting her axe. It would be hard to lay it down, but then again, it would make a fine ornament to hang above her tavern's bar. Peace and fucking quiet, at long last. Annie had expected Starson's grin to widen, and for him to crack his usual woodpecker laugh that could cut through the chatter of even the busiest night. Instead, his face fell. Annie tensed, realising the bard had stopped scraping at his arguel, that all the chatter had died to complete silence. "Starson?" A whisper of "fuck" was his only reply. Annie slowly turned, scanning the room. Every one of the drinkers had turned to face them, even the eavesdroppers from before. Half were shades, hooded and cloaked, giving the pipe smoke haze a bluer tinge. The rest were living. Every one of them held something metal and sharp in their hands, and they stared at Annie with soulless, piercing eyes. She spied the telltale red beneath their cloaks and rags. Annie Jezebel's shoulders sagged, and she looked up at the somehow beer-spattered ceiling in utter exasperation. Of course. It couldn't be that bloody simple, could it? Before any of the cultists could think about leaving their seats, Annie burst into action. She tore the axe from her belt and drove it into the nearest table and chairs. The furniture fell to matchsticks, cascading across the tavern's hall. While the splinters were still falling, Annie swung again, taking apart another table and the two cultists that were struggling to escape her blade. The first man it caught was cleaved in two. The next lost an arm and collapsed to the floor, screeching as he hosed the stone with his blood. Annie spun in ever-changing circles, sweeping legs and forming a clearing of destruction about her. Stools and chairs exploded either side of her. The cultists swarmed, but even lucky cuts across her bare arms failed to slow her. If anything, it goaded the blood-crazed beast within her. Starson had hauled a trigger bow from under the bar and was busy blasting any cultist that attempted to vault his bar. When his bolts ran out, he smashed a flagon and began to hack and slash at anybody that moved. No sooner had Annie lopped the head from the bard than more shades flooded into the bar. No disguises masked these shades. They wore their armour and robes openly. Annie welcomed them in, picking up a short sword to swing alongside her axe. The handle was slick with blood, misted with vapour, and its blade was notched like a row of teeth, but she still grinned. "Come on, then!" Starson was mid-shout when Annie realised why the shades were not charging. With a concussive thwack, the barman reeled backwards, a bolt half buried in his forehead. More trigger bows appeared, resting calmly in gloves and gauntlets. Annie shook her head, despising them. Bows had always been the tools of assassins and cowards. "Where is he? Where is that bastard Danib? Bring out the mute traitor!" Annie cried, raising her bloody weapons to the roof while corpses moaned about her and blue vapour traced her legs. And there he was, the great armoured ghost of Danib Ironjaw, ducking under the arch of the tavern's hall, the horns of his helmet drawing sparks against the granite. There was a fainter glow in those white eyes tonight. Annie could see it even through her throbbing, blood-filled vision. He walked stiffly and with a limp. "Attain must have given you a run for your silver, I see," Annie challenged him. "And a new sword." Danib drew the greatsword from its scabbard and held it calmly upright before him in a salute. He stared at her from either side of its thick blade, emanating white mist. "A soul blade, you say?" Annie said. "And I see your masters have no interest in keeping our bargain." Danib shook his head with a crunch of steel. "I should have known," Annie chuckled dryly. "What else would I expect from a traitorous cult like yours?" Danib grunted. "Church? Fuck you! That word has no meaning in this world," Annie spat. She smacked the short sword against her breastplate, spraying droplets of crimson. She smeared it across her face like an old Scatterisle pirate. "Come on then, Danib! You've always wanted to test me in my axe. I know it. Seen it in your eyes, I have. Tonight you finally can, half-life!" Danib started forwards, but somewhere in the crowd of robed shades, a blue hand alighted on his vambrace as gently as a feather, and he halted mid-stride. "No," sighed a voice Annie recognised. "Come on!" Annie roared, beginning to charge. "Fuck the cult!" The first bolt hit her in the sternum, punching through the metal and kicking the wind from her, but not the momentum. The second bit through the flesh of her arm. Her axe tumbled from her grip, clattering on the floor with the ringing of a bell. Annie hurtled on as the bows continued to fire. Bolt by bolt they slowed her, until Annie fell to her knees, a score of arrows protruding from her chest, thighs, arms and neck. And despite it all, she grinned through a mouthful of blood as Danib moved forward, sword held high. Her laugh was a bubbling wheeze. "Like I told Temsa not too long before he died, he's treacherous at the top of the mountain." "Put her out of her misery, Danib," ordered the sister, still hidden in the ranks of shades. Annie's vision was beginning to mist at the edges. "Leave her body and shade here to rot." Annie Jexabel looked up at the great shade of Danib and watched him raise his sword over her head, its point shining as if bejewelled. For just a moment, she watched the flickering in the shade's glowing eyes. With a snort, She spat blood at him. "You'll meet your match one day. Don't you worry." Danib brought the blade down with all the force of a landslide, piercing Annie's skull and driving the soul blade to the floorboards beneath. "General Hachette!" came the cry, hollering down the corridors of frescoes and shiny marble. Hachette turned, finding a royal guard running towards him at full pelt. The man would have clattered into the wall had he not managed a skillful skid across the polished floor. "Report!" he gasped. "From all over the city!"
"Report of what, man? Tell me!"
Hachette replaced his plumed helmet and reached for his spear. The soldier, even between deep breaths, took the time to look prickled at the fact a shade was giving him orders. Hachette was used to it and prodded him in the breastplate. "Chamber's been attacked! Scrutinisers murdered in the streets, one by one! Chamber of military might, too! They say Lord General Truth has been slain in his bed, stabbed so many times there wasn't a drop of blood left in him. Araxes with small armies of house guards, a bank—" His breath escaped him again, and the guard leaned against a column. Other shade soldiers had heard the news and begun to gather around the general and the guard. Left with no orders and no princess to protect, they'd been sequestered halfway up the cloud piercer in empty chambers, abandoned by some living Serek who fled to Bellish or somewhere Hachette had never been.
"Any word of the Empress in waiting?"
"None. Wager is the cult have her."
"Fuck!" Hachette cursed. "I knew this mission would be trouble."
"The Empress will claim the throne tomorrow. Grand Nixwell. Rumour is Cicene will be the—"
Thunk!
The trigger bow bolt protruding from his chest distracted him. It happened so abruptly, it took a moment for him to register he had been shot. By the time he had grasped the black fletching, he was already sliding down the wall, heart stopped. The soldiers bristled, quickly falling into formation. Hachette stood at their centre, shield high and spear forwards. He stamped his foot, and it was echoed by his soldiers. The phalanx grew by the moment as more soldiers ran to join them. From beyond the light of the lanterns, an empty and open hand emerged, followed by a woman in smart plate and mail. Her head was enveloped in a hood, and a red cloak trailed behind her. At her side, she grasped a sack made of some dead animal. The head of a dog or wolf was still attached to the hide, lolling in Hachette's direction and staring at him with glassy eyes. Beyond Lyria, Hachette could see other shapes waiting there, and the dull glint of steel and arrowheads. "Good evening, Soldier General Hachette," said the shade, in a voice as soft as velvet.
"State your name and business."
The woman held out the hide sack. It looked heavy, swollen. "Enlightened Sister Lyria, and my business is with you, and the question of your allegiance," Lyria replied. Hachette shook his head.
"That is not in question, cultist. Our master is Cicene Talon Ranala."
He stamped his foot once more, and his soldiers shook the corridor. The shade smiled. "Is that so?" she asked. Seizing the bottom of the hide sack, Lyria shook it out, casting a pile of half-coins across the marble. "Now you are your own masters." Hachette could feel the draw to his coin, somewhere amongst the pile, the slip of copper he had not seen or touched in years. Behind him, the soldiers began to whisper. Some crept forwards, breaking formation.
"What is it you want?"
"Your allegiance," Lyria said with a shrug. "But through choice. Stand with the Church of Sesh tomorrow at the Grand Nixwell. Watch the dawn of a new era." With a pretend clearing of his throat, Hachette threw down his shield and spear. They clanged against the marble, breaking the silence. Then he removed his helmet, and after looking at his lack of a reflection in the polished steel, he cast it aside. Chapter 25. A Spark. A weaker mind is broken by struggle and misfortune. Greater minds triumph over them. From the great philosopher Menem. A poet once said there is such a thing as too much thinking, that a constant search for better answers can dim even the brightest of ideas. Caltro Basalt looked as though he had done far too much thinking. He had spent the night doing nothing but, after all, and as unusual as it was for him, he had done it in almost complete silence. There had been the few odd words, "Stop staring at me," and "Nothing, just trust me," whenever Pointy questioned what Caltro had seen in the small, smoky room. Whatever decision he was striving to reach, it seemed a torturous one. He had roamed around the sparse room beneath the earth, switching between bed, chair, pacing even the floor and back again. A cycle as repetitive as the stories he was no doubt weaving in that blue skull of his. It was odd for a sword to pray, but Pointy felt like doing it anyway, and hoped to the dead gods Caltro was choosing the right path. He had been forced to flit between so many in his desperate search for freedom. Through it all, the strange phantom dog the cult had apparently gifted him hung by his side. It was a long-legged, lean thing, with a sharp snout and ears like Araxes' spires. A white scar traced its entire body, from under its white eyes to its swishing tail. God knew why, but the thing had an affinity for the locksmith. It lay down when he did, paced when he did, even buried its blue nose in its paws when Caltro tried for the 50th time to rip out his vaporous hair. Pointy was forced to watch the whole evening and morning on his side, laid flat on a wooden lockbox. It was strange how accustomed to that view of the world he had become over the years. "Caltro," Pointy spoke up after perhaps an hour or two of idly looking around the room, watching the locksmith try to sweat. "You're running out of time. What are you going to do? Surely you're not going to help the cult. Nilith has the—" "Quiet, Pointy, I told you. Trust me." The phantom dog looked at the sword with the same judging look as Caltro did, and Pointy held his tongue, for a while at least. "Don't I get a say in all of this, or do I just have to hang off your hip the entire time?" Caltro covered his face with his hands, and the phantom whined as it covered its head with a paw. Bang went the door, and Pointy knew the chance for talking some sense into him was over. Normally, Caltro would challenge every goddamned word. His lack of rebuttal was ominous. An armoured, enlightened Sister Lyria entered the room alone, but Pointy caught a glimpse of the thick, steel-plated legs of Danib lurking outside. The blade of a familiar-looking greatsword hung below his hip. Pointy scowled as deeply as he could. "I trust you are rested, brother," said Lyria cheerily. "As much as a ghost can be." "Ghost? How crass of you," the sister tittered. Caltro raised his chin, lips tight. "Shade is too soft a term for the way we are treated," he replied, and Lyria nodded appreciatively. "I am pleased to hear that, brother. Come, time is short. Pharazar's ghost wanes. However—" Lyria held up a finger before moving to lift Pointy from the trunk, one hand on his blade, one on the handle. Pointy concentrated hard. It was tougher than usual, as if Lyria felt him touching her mind, but he managed to make her flinch enough to slice a white line into her palm. "Ah!" she hissed, placing Pointy on the bed. "A sharp sword indeed, Caltro." "Isn't he just?" replied the locksmith, eyeing Pointy with what the sword assumed to be distaste. "We have one last gift for you." "You spoil me, sister." Lyria produced some spindly lockpicks from her robe. "My tools!" The ones we could recover. Care to try your hand at the lockbox? Caltro seemed to stifle a chuckle. Pointy wondered how the Shade always managed to have levity in these situations. He was incorrigible. "You don't want to know what happened the last time I tackled a lockbox," he said. Pointy dreaded to think. Within a few short moments, the locksmith proved his worth and heaved the trunk open until the lid stayed upright. Pretty?" Pointy strained to see from the bed. The phantom dog was blocking half the view, playing at panting. "Copper core for ease of wear and bound with steel so it does not harm your vapours. Made by the finest church smiths. Did you know Sesh is also god of the forge?" explained Lyria. Caltro lifted up a pauldron of hammered steel and intricate scale mail, and finally Pointy understood what the fuss was over. "I did not," said Caltro. "However, I am not usually one for armour." Lyria began to strap pieces onto the locksmith as she spoke. "You are not usually one for standing beside an empress as she claims her throne, but you shall today, as will we all. There." Caltro examined himself, pulling at hinges and flexing, as if he were expecting to do some gymnastics. "All right," he said. "Thank you once again, sister." "As we told you, Caltro, there are many benefits to being a dutiful member of the Church of Sesh." Lyria was already leading him to the door, and so far, Caltro seemed content to leave both the sword and the phantom on the bed. Until the last moment, when he shrugged away from Lyria's guiding hand and grabbed Pointy's handle. "Almost forgot," he said with a roll of his eyes. Pointy caught Lyria's stare once the sword hung from the locksmith's belt. It was intent, examining every fleck of mica in Pointy's obsidian pommel. He kept his scowl. If there was anything an inanimate object with a soul trapped inside it was good at, it was winning staring contests, and Lyria quickly lost as they weaved through the corridors. Nilith paced. Pacing was good for the soul, good for the heart, good for the mind, or so she'd been told by her daughter. This was a good thing, seeing as each one of hers was in disarray. Then again, considering how Cicine had turned out, perhaps pacing was not all that beneficial. Nilith stopped in the middle of the small square of flagstone she had found, trapped between two levels high up the cathedral. She had lost count of the wagons and supplies she had seen ferried past her. There had been an endless stream of ghosts, living, beetles, horses, centipedes, donkeys, each piled high with bundles. And soldiers, thousands of them, every one of them a ghost, and each bearing a sword and spear. It seemed every single one of the souls that had crammed the tears of the Quatre had now vacated above ground, leaving the cathedral spookily empty and devoid of sound. It made Nilith uncomfortable, much like the void of the desert nights, dreading the galloping of hooves. She wished Attain were there. The old ghost had always managed to either goad her or scold her onto the right path. That, or make her realise she was already on it. In the evening, she had spared a single and private tear for her old house shade, her coracle within the tumultuous rapids of the Talon Renala household. She had cursed the name of Danib Ironjaw, too. Removing her borrowed scimitar from its sheath, Nilith swung it around to test the stretch of her old ceremonial armour, delivered sometime in the night by the cultists. It had been a decade since she had last worn it, maybe longer. It was a little looser in some places after her time in the desert, but it was fine steel and gold, studded with shards of turquoise and aquamarine. It made Nilith stand a fraction straighter and feel the empress she had to play today. She swung again, and there was a jolt at her throat. She dug under her breastplate to adjust the pouch of Old Fenn's powder. Like the copper coin that hung next to it, both had become charms of luck. Nilith closed her eyes as she held them, feeling the cold, ragged edges of her body, and took a deep breath to keep from shuddering. The ghast's poison was barely hidden by her collar. It had also begun to spread down her stomach, bringing pains as the living parts died before turning to vapour. A jangling of chains distracted her, telling her the last inhabitants of Caltro Basalt were due to leave. Nilith turned around to find sisters Lyria and Yaradin, Caltro and the horned monster of Danib standing with a group of prisoners. A flutter of wings told her the cult had kept their promise of healing Bazel, but she hadn't yet asked them to release the falcon. Not yet. Nilith met his golden eyes, and though they were narrowed, she could see he understood. Cecine stood there, between Harana and Temsa. Iron collars were clasped around their necks, or arms in Temsa's case, and their chains held by a group of heavily armoured cult soldiers that stood behind them. Amongst them was Pharazar, wearing the stormiest expression of them all.
"Is this how you would have the city see their empress-in-waiting, mother, or the Cloud Court, chained and bound? How dare you?"
Lyria approached Nilith before she could answer. In the ghost's hand, she held 3 half-coins. Nilith recognised their glyphs immediately. "For when you decide what to do with them," Lyria advised in a quiet voice. "If I may?" The sister held out a short cloak and draped it over the Empress's left arm, where blue vapour curled from between the joints in her armour and frosted the gold. "Are you ready, Empress?" Nilith looked at her scowling daughter, knowing that Cecine would only hate her more from here on in. Harana was just as outraged, but as far as Nilith was concerned, the cult should have left her on the flagstones. What hope she'd had of Cecine coming around to her way of thinking had been dashed the moment she'd awoken to find her dead daughter staring back at her from across the cell, quite unable to form words, except somehow she managed to form enough to curse her. Nilith's months away had gilded Cecine's demeanour towards her and romanticised their relationship. Now, seeing father and daughter beside each other, matching furrows on their brows, Nilith knew she would always be an outsider. It cut like a dagger to the heart to see it so plainly, but it was unavoidable. It felt like failure to her. "Ready, Empress?" Lyria said again. "I am," answered Nilith, nodding resolutely. She took her place at the head of the group, near where Caltro stood. The locksmith gave her a wry smile, but otherwise faced forwards and stayed silent. "I didn't take you for the armour-wearing sort," Nilith whispered to Caltro. He flexed his ash-grey gauntlets. "When you can't beat them—" "Join them," she sighed.
"Am I the only one who hasn't lost his mind?" said a metallic voice between them.
"And what would you have us do?" Caltro snapped at the sword on his hip. Lyria and Yaradin flanked them, silent, their eyes wide and eager. They seemed enlivened. Taking the lead, the sisters guided them up a series of wide ramps that emerged within a grand warehouse on what Nilith assumed to be street level. A swathe of soldiers and beasts and wagons awaited them. "There is a whole district between here and the Grand Nixwell," she said. "A parade is customary, Empress. There are those who do not believe such a saviour has appeared in their direst hours. They need to see it with their own eyes," Lyria replied. "And do you not deserve to be welcomed as a victor after all you fought for?" Lyria gestured behind Nilith, and the Empress turned to find Anoish standing behind her, dwarfed between 2 horned scarabs bearing pairs of riders. He had been groomed from snout to tail and was bedecked with gold and turquoise ribbons. A skirt of mail hung from his sides, and a gold-spiked saffron placed over his proud nose. His dark, chestnut eyes stared at her with part excitement, part blame for his costume. Nilith thought he looked regal for a desert horse.
"You deserve none of this, mother!" Cecine cried.
"Hear, hear!" Pharazar joined in. Daneb threatened both of them with the tip of his greatsword.
You stay back, beast! You didn't scare me in the time of my father, and you don't scare me now, argued Pharazar.
Daneb growled at that, making vapour puff from the vents of his horned helmet like the hot breath of a beast. Pharazar shrank away. Weak as Nilith was, mounting the horse took several tries, but with Caltro's help she managed it. It felt satisfying to be astride the horse again. Anoish seemed to feel it too, prancing this way and that, his hooves clopping on the floorboards. With the clanking of chains, the doors of the warehouse were opened and bright sunlight spilled across the dusty floor. Nilith could see palm trees and sandstone pillars etched with weathered faces of past emperors and empresses. A horn was blasted somewhere amidst the throng of glowing soldiers, and with a rumble of feet and hooves and armour, the entourage formed up to leave. The procession gathered momentum within moments. Shouts ricocheted down the avenue of Ashiram, bringing crowds from the towers and grand houses that lined the wide street. With the cult soldiers forming a blade of shields and spears, they cut through the growing crowds swiftly, leaving Nilith to look about at the Arctians as she rode at the front of the procession. Caltro rode alongside on a horse, looking rather uneasy. The sisters rode behind them in an open carriage, shielded from the sun by cotton umbrellas. The ghost prisoners were kept in a similar carriage that tailed theirs.
"Nyx water! Nyx water!" came the shouts from the crowd, over and over, no matter how many cheers or yells of Empress, and no matter how much richer the avenue around them grew.
I wish I could tell them that by the end of today they won't need to worry about Nyx water, Nilith muttered to the ghost by her side. Caltro didn't deign to reply, merely looking around, eyeing up the living who brayed for water.
"You're quiet today, locksmith."
The ghost turned his white eyes upon her.
"Is it me, or has everything been said? Doing, not talking, is what today needs," he replied sternly,
as if trying to convince himself of the same truth. Nilith remained silent for the remainder of the journey, too busy drinking in the moment she had dreamed of for months, perhaps years if she was truthful. It was too easy to be swept up in the adoration, the power of it all, if she let herself fall for it. Freedom. Justice. Nilith kept the words spinning around and around her head, even when swathes of the crowd fell to their knees as she passed, as if she were a dead god risen, and when lotus and rose petals fell like snow on crass steps. Before long, Nilith spied the black tips of the Grand Nixwell's tusks over the smaller highroads and more modest buildings. Her heart, stubbornly clinging on despite the flesh about it turning to cold mist, began to thud, reverberating around what was left of her body. Nilith forced herself to count every beat, lest some cruel twist of luck make it fail before she had claimed Pharazar's throne. She clutched the grey cloak about her left arm, ensuring it hadn't slipped. Their progress slowed as the crowds squeezed into the half-dozen spoke avenues that met at the Grand Nixwell. Looking over the heads of the masses, almost equal parts glowing and living, Nilith could see the avenues congested for miles until distance and heat haze stole their number from view. A large quota of wagons parked along the sides of the streets complicated issues greatly, but cult soldiers stood around them, even used them as parapets from which to watch the crowds. Once inside the plaza, Nilith gazed out over the knight statues kneeling before the Grand Nixwell, swords in hand and heads bowed. It took another hour, perhaps longer, for the ghost soldiers to part the crowds enough to make a path to the Nixwell's dais. The cries of "Nyx water!" became almost constant. Here and there, she spotted handcarts carrying slumped corpses, or the familiar sight of bloodied sacks tugged by ropes. Some were hopefuls, eager to bind their dead in the same well and water a royal had been bound in. The rest were desperate,
and looked as though they had been dragging their unbound for almost as many miles as Nilith had, just to find a Nixwell that wasn't dry. Fights broke out here and there beyond the ever-moving halo of cheering and bowing bodies. Red-cloaked soldiers spread amongst the crowds to put them out like forest fires. Around the Nixwell, intersecting rings of houseguards protected Araxes' richest, those who had apparently survived Thames' cull. Nilith looked down upon Tors, Tals, Serex, celebrities and war heroes, and every one of them looked back with burning envy. The soldiers raised their shields higher as they descended the tiers of the Grand Nixwell, and Nilith was glad for it. Her heart was climbing up her throat. The tension was a bowstring at full stretch. A cheer began to course through the countless masses, rising and falling as it reached different hemispheres of the great stone plaza. Nilith felt her breathing become short, as if their voices stole the breath from the air. In the vacuum between the crowds and the dais, grey-robed Nixites waited behind ranks and ranks of dead soldiers. They watched Nilith avidly, bowing timidly as she dismounted Anoish and began to tread the stairs. Caltro walked behind her, with Lyria and Yaredon seeing to the ghosts and the body of the Emperor, which, Nilith was pleased to see, had been re-wrapped. 9, 8, 7... Nilith counted down as she climbed, as if she had been counting since Bellish. 6, she muttered aloud as she stumbled, her left leg shaking. Not now, she hissed to herself. To her surprise, Caltro was there, keeping her upright and dignified. His face was expressionless, eyes somewhat glazed over, as if he walked through a dream he'd had before. Up they climbed, until they stood on the platform they'd graced not 2 days before. Nilith was as breathless as she had been then. She stared out across the Nixwell, and the masses stretching to a man-made horizon of spires and towers. The crowd must have been 1 million strong, perhaps 1 million more in the streets. And half that number dead, she thought. Swallowing the choking beat of her heart, Nilith stood tall and strode to the edge of the platform. Below her, a pool of black water awaited a body. The vibrations from the feet of the crowd rippled lazily across its oily surface. Nilith turned to find the platform crowded with the cult and the chained ghosts. Before her, 2 Nixites waited with the body of Pharazar. They were busy cutting open the fresh wrappings. She caught Pharazar peering past Danib's shoulder to ogle his own corpse. Judging by the foul look on his face, he immediately regretted it. Nilith watched as they peeled back the cloth to show a corpse twisted and warped by rot and the elements. Most of its features had collapsed, showing the white skeleton in places. Portions had dried like old meat, desiccated and speckled with sand. Other parts were black and slick with putrid liquid, and the tails of maggots could be seen waving about. Pharazar's face was what held her gaze. A gawping mask of shock, visible even in death and decay. The Nixites had iron stomachs, and without blinking, they positioned themselves at the edge of the platform, at Nilith's feet, ready to surrender the corpse to the Nix. If she thought Pharazar had finally accepted his fate, Nilith was wrong. He began to rage against his chains, yelling, "I am the Emperor! She is a murderer! I am the Emperor!" Over and over. He caused so much fuss, Danib had to squeeze his head between his arm and his chest to silence him. As the cheering died, and whispers spread between the crowds, the enlightened sisters came close, speaking in turn. "It is time, Empress. Take your place amongst history. Do what you set out to do all those months ago. Free the Empire."
Lyria urged. With a deep breath, Nilith turned to face the droves waiting on her. Save for the rustling of chatter here and there, and the occasional shouting, the crowds were eerily silent. In all the time spent fighting the desert, she had prepared speech after speech for this very moment. Now 1,000,000 eyes were turned upon her, heavy with expectation. Every rehearsal had faded from memory. All she had to do was convince them to reverse 1,000 years of history. "Arctians!" Nilith bellowed, as loudly as her hoarse throat would allow. "I am Empress Nilith Rykar Renala, daughter of Crass King Conan, Lady of Soraka, wife of once Emperor Pharazar Talin Renala the 18th, and in accordance with Emperor Phylar's decree, I am here to stake my claim on the throne of the Arctian Empire." While the nobles clapped their hands in mock appreciation, the crowds beyond merely rumbled with ambiguous noises. Nilith clasped her cloak tight, making sure no vapour would betray her. "Traditionally, the emperors or empresses that have stood before me have proclaimed wealth and prosperity for all. I have always thought them liars," Nilith proclaimed, garnering more of a response, albeit a shout for "Nyx water!" "Precisely!" Nilith yelled, feeling her momentum growing. "Emperor Pharazar did nothing but continue this royal trend, and what has he done for you but hide in his sanctuary and let this proud city sink under the weight of murder and poor rule? You cry Nyx water because Pharazar and scores of others over the centuries have done nothing but perpetuate a society that feeds upon itself. A society that breeds monsters like Boran Temza, who would see this city on its knees for their profit, like many that stand before you today." There came the shouts and cheers of approval. The scapegoat for the city's angst had been named. Danib thrust Temza forward to show him to the crowd, and boos and jeers joined in the noise. They spread through the crowd like a spark through a dry field. Through it all, Nilith stared at the nobles around the Nyxwell, much to their glowering. "Ingrate!" yelled Temza, receiving more hatred from the crowd. Half of that audience must have been murderers themselves, yet a mob will never fret about turning on its own. From the corner of her vision, Nilith caught Caltro staring at her, waiting on her words like every other citizen of the city of countless souls. She took the fierce look in his white eyes for one of encouragement. "I wish for change, as I know many of you do. I want a city that does not need to suffer shortages of Nyx water." A roar of voices rose, like a hurricane approaching shore. "Or grain, or shelter. A city that protects its neighbours instead of murdering them in their sleep." Applause joined the shouts, like fat drops of rain on a palm frond roof. "A city not constrained by the rules of a despot from 1,000 years ago." Thousands of fists punched the air in agreement. Nilith ripped the copper coin and chain from her neck and held it high. Her boot hovered over Pharazar's corpse, ready to push. "A city without binding and indenturement!" she roared. Nilith's spell over the masses broke like a stained glass window before a boulder. Those nearest the Grand Nyxwell fell still first, and their confusion spread out in waves. Some who were not without their wits saw sense and began to chant in favour. Ghosts in their hundreds took up the chant. A brawl broke out. "No!" barked a nearby Seric. "That is treason!" yelled another. Hot tears sprang to Nilith's eyes, tears of anger and disbelief. The entire city was comprised of fools, still reaching for fire with hands covered in burns. Plainly before them, they could see the evil that plagued their lives, and yet were content to let it stay, even willingly invite it in.
Not in all her days and nights enduring the sands has she dared to imagine this. A shout ripped from her throat, echoing across the plaza like a battle horn. I am Empress Nilith Rykar Renala, first of that name, and my first decree is— It was then that Caltro seized her. Nobody was more surprised than Nilith, suddenly grappling with a ghost who was desperately trying to pull her arm off. No, not my arm! With a flapping of red fabric and the twang of a strap, her cloak ripped free, along with a gauntlet. As Nilith wrenched backwards, she bared her ghostly hand to the sunlight for all the crowd to see.
Caltro, what are you doing? Pointy's panicked shout filled my head, momentarily deafening me as I ripped Nilith's gauntlet free. The gasp that sprinted through the masses was almost comical. What was far from comical was the reaction. Half the crowd was stunned silent. The other looked revolted. It was no surprise the latter half still had a beating heart in their chests. Scattered fighting broke out as opinions clashed. "What is that?" came the complaints, multitudinous in their outcry. "Is she dead or alive? A dead queen? No shape can sit on the throne." "Caltro!" yelled the sword, cutting through the tumult of voices. Ignoring him, I turned with a victorious grin stretched across my face, facing the enlightened sisters. Behind them, the chained ghosts struggled against their captors. "A revolution requires a revolt. Your plan has been laid bare, sisters," I crowed, much to the confusion of every face in my vicinity. Even the Nixites had the cheek to look shocked. Nilith shoved me, sending me sprawling across the white marble. "You stupid fuck, Caltro Basalt! Look what you've done!" "They plan to turn the dead against the living, a massacre, Nilith. They showed me," I yelled, trying to figure out why Lyria and Yaradine still wore their infernal smirks and why Danib hadn't reduced me to smoke. I figured it out. With the code abolished, ghosts have no masters to fear. What's the result? An uprising led by the cult. Look, where are the scrutinizers? The chamber? Have you even noticed Chamberlain Rebene isn't even here? Where are your royal guard? All they needed from you was a crowd. Dead God, Caltro, you're right! I levelled a finger at the sisters. I know I'm right. So were the dead gods. They thought they could pull the wool over my eyes, but not me. That is the flood they want to unleash on the world. A flood of dead. It was as if scales fell from Nilith's eyes as she looked through the crowd. The only soldiers that stood near the dais were made of vapour. When her gaze fell upon the corpse of Pharazar, I could have strangled her. I saw my own stubbornness staring back at me. "It has to be done. To save our humanity," she yelled. "No!" I lunged for her once more, but her gold fist swatted me away. "Stop, Nilith, it's not worth it!" With a snarl, Nilith broke the copper coin in half with brute strength. I dove for her legs, bringing her to her knees. With a barrage of savage kicks, she fought me off, managing to jam one half of the coin into the corpse's disjointed mouth. With a shriek, she threw her shoulder behind Pharazar's body and pushed it over the precipice. I barged Nilith as it tumbled, driving the wind from the Empress with my armoured shoulder. I saw the copper half-coin burst from her hand, and I dove after it as if it were my own. The tips of my fingers grazed its metal. I snatched it like it was the edge of a cliff I was about to topple over. In truth, that wasn't far from my situation. My body was sliding after me. My hips had already slipped over the marble edge, and yet, even as I began to topple, I still had time to watch the desiccated, rotting corpse swallowed by the Nyx. Before his grinning face was consumed by the black water, I saw the flash of copper between Pharazar's ashen teeth. No sooner had it vanished than I noticed the burning deep within my palm, as the copper half-coin seared my vapours. It was then that something grabbed my legs. Chapter 26. The Battle of Araxes. Of all the epic poems told of the deeds of men, many forget the story of Calabar, who purportedly stood alone against 1,000 men with a single soul blade. Few details survive the 200 years that have passed, but they speak of smoke surrounding him like a tornado, billowing from his blade. From A Reach History by Gervin Jubb. The first thing I noticed was the vengeful snarling of Nilith and her sharp fingers digging at my armour in her rage. "Everything I've worked for," she was screaming. The rest was wordless. Danib dragged me away from her and threw me to the side, and the second thing I noticed was the laughing. The uproar had reached fever pitch as the masses witnessed the debacle upon the dais, and yet the musical notes of the sisters' laughter somehow cut their way straight to my soul. It was Lyria and Yaradin, bearing wide smiles. "Caltro Basalt, the wise, all-seeing emperor, Caltro Basalt, first of his name," Lyria called. I stared down at the half-moon in my hand, watching my vapours spit and sizzle around it, and realised what I had done. Yaradin clapped her hands silently. "How far you've come, Caltro! You arrived in this city of thief, and now you stand as emperor." I struggled to my feet, watching Nilith seethe. "No, I've stopped your flood. The code still stands." Sister Lyria stepped forwards. "Wisdom was never your strong point, was it, Brother Caltro? You were correct about the crowd, but the code does not matter to us. It is the tenets we trust in, gods given by Almighty Sesh. No man or shade can change them, not even the Emperor." Nilith stopped struggling. I swore I heard screams somewhere among the sea of yelling people. I chanced to look over my shoulder. There was a commotion on the far side of the plaza. I could see its ripples sweeping outwards like those of a rock cast in a lake. I heard the anxious whinnying of a nearby horse. "What is it, Caltro?" Pointy asked, sounding nervous. Yaradin spoke loudly over the roar. "We care nothing for the throne. We care nothing for charity," cried Lyria. I looked out. To the closest the buildings came to the Nixwell. There was something spanning the avenue. Wagons, barrels, a wall. I could tell not, but the crowd scattered in their thousands, trying to escape it. I felt a deep unsettling within my chest. "You snakes! It was too good to be true! What are you doing?" Nilith demanded. "We told you, Nilith. A sacrifice is demanded to build the new world," yelled the sisters as one. It was a slaughter. The cult of Sesh had made a trap of the plaza. A death trap, and their prey numbered in the millions. Panic overtook the crowd. Shoving and screaming, they surged from avenue to avenue in clumps of thousands. Straining my dull eyes, I could see the walls of barrels and wagons blockading the streets. Ghosts in red armour that had roamed through the dense crowds began to hack, stab, and slash at anything made of flesh and blood. Every direction I looked in, I saw phalanxes of cultists going about their bloody work. Even living soldiers turned against their own kind. Riders on tall beetles paraded through the chaos, spearing stragglers. Even around the Nixwell, cult and royal soldiers that had stood guard about clusters of nobles turned their spears on their charges, bringing the murder close at hand. I saw a Noash barge his way through a shield wall, fleeing the madness. I peered at the streets again and saw cultists attacking the barrels with hatchets, cracking staves. As murky Nyx water cascaded onto the plaza, drenching those that had already fallen to the cult's blades. I realized then what all the preparation had been for. Grey vapour began to curl from the waters, as if they boiled around the dead. "Don't just stand there," Pointy howled, and I flinched instinctively. A triggerbow bolt clattered from the black stone tusk behind me. More bolts began to fly at the platform from a troop of houseguards. Some pudgy Serach, far too slow on the uptake, seeking to make his name out of the bewilderment, even though his own houseguards were at that moment being overrun by cult soldiers. "Caltro!" yelled the Empress. I dove to the stone near Nilith, whose saucer eyes were still trying to make sense of the chaos that had descended upon the plaza. We were at the eye of the battlefield, and everywhere I looked, fighting and murder reigned. More insects, spiders, and centipedes were barreling through the crowds on the eastern side. A fire had broken out in the north. Smoke was now sweeping across the plaza, darkening the skies. I began, but the Empress shook her head so avidly I thought she was having a seizure. After. If there's going to be an after, Nilith hissed at me. Witness Sesh's glory firsthand. Lyria and Yaredin were screeching over the roar of the dying and the terrified. Nilith hauled me upright with her ghost hand, our vapours mingling. I don't know about you, Emperor, she shouted in my ear, but I've had about enough of those fucking sisters. Pair of cunts, if you ask me, and I've come to strongly despise the colour red, I said, baring my teeth at the sisters, and the monster that stood beside them. Dread swamped me. I had come to the Grand Nixwell expecting to leave it fighting. I had wrestled with this inevitability every hour of the night, and still no escape had presented itself. It had taken me until dawn to realize it was the price of my freedom. And yet even now I glanced over my shoulder considering the pit of Nixwater below me. But alas, the runner had finally run out of places to run. Fuck it, I said to myself, resolving to have a strong word with the next dead god that showed his face. Caltro, Pointy bellowed at me aloud, quickly stowing Farazar's coin beneath my armour. I seized the soul blade from my belt. What? I yelled, staring at the sisters and their damnable smiles. I never told you my other name, said the sword. Danib rolled his shoulders and I heard the crunch of armour over the roar of the massacre. I remember, Absir. No, I once went by another name. Yera Anku. The great monster stepped forward and the entire platform shuddered. With a ring, Nilith drew her scimitar, a great curve of silver and copper. This really isn't the time for a fucking conversation. I held him up, yelling at his pommel stone. I expected to see wide eyes, but instead I saw a calm face, almost smug. I tried to move my arm, but I was frozen. Danib unsheathed his huge sword, raising it high for a smiting blow. Pointy! Do you know what it means, Caltro? I would have screamed at him, had grey vapours not flowed down my arm, spiralling around my vambraces. His obsidian blade took on my blue hue. Danib's horned shadow fell across me, his burning eyes focused solely on mine. Point's whisper of an answer was deafening. Invincible. Unbidden, my arm flicked upwards. I cried out in a mix of confusion and terror. The impact was enough to flatten me to my knees. I prized open my eyes and found two crossed blades before me, edges glowing white-hot and vapours reeling against each other. Periseth, Pointy growled. My sister! I swear I heard a voice in the furious sizzling of the blades. With a roar, Danib came at me, but Nilith distracted him with a blow to his gauntlet. The beast bellowed, reaching for her, but the Empress was nimble. This wasn't her first fight. Pointy drove me at Danib, spinning a figure of 8 before me that left a spiral of blue smoke. Danib met us with a mighty sweep of the great sword. Sparks flew as our blades crashed. Our vapours roiled from the impact. Pointy was arcing through the air before I could stop him. Danib's greave tore like silver foil, and he responded with a bellow that would have made a dune worm quail. But before I or the sword could react, the monster's boot came swinging for my ribs, and I was launched into the air. Somersaulting over the marble sweep of the Nixwell and the writhing mass, I crashed to a heap against a step. Had I breath, it would have been driven from me. My only injury was a crushed pauldron. Seeking to pierce my shoulder, I ripped it free as I stumbled to my feet. I was welcomed to the battlefield by a war hammer swinging at my face, a red-robed cultist grinning at the other end of it. Once again, my sword arm sprang into action, shearing through the stone hammerhead as if it was papyrus. Swing interrupted, the cultist pitched forwards. I held Pointy at my hip and the ghost skewered himself on the blade like a gruesome kebab before exploding into blue vapour. How am I doing this? I cried out. If I listened carefully, I could hear Pointy cackling. You're not, Caltro. I am. I told you you were in excellent hands. Who are you? This is why you should have spoken your mind. Leave the lesson for later. I heard a screech upon the dais, and saw Nilith clutch her side as Danib's blade drew an arc of blood in its wake. Her scimitar had already lost its point, and as I watched, the great ghost cleaved the rest of it away. Periseth came slicing, and with a cry, Nilith tumbled from the lip of the marble into the black waters below. Danib saw me amongst the phalanxes of house guards amid the dead and battling. He levelled Periseth at me and began to march along the dais towards the steps. "Fuck!" I said aloud, involuntarily ducking as a spear jabbed for my face. My parrying strike caught the cult soldier in the sternum, and he crumpled to the ground in a pool of blue smoke. "We have to face him, Caltro." "We?" I said, looking between the chaotic masses, to see Nilith spluttering as she hauled herself from the side of the Nixwell pool. I sprinted for her, Pointy's mind and mine joined together. Trust. It was the ingredient this disastrous concoction of an existence had been missing all along. The dead gods, Pointy, even myself. I hacked through the pillars of iron and stone surrounding the pool, and the thick bars between them. I felt the thunder in the ground as Danib increased his pace. "Hurry, Nilith," I yelled. Her armour had tried its best to drown her, but she burst through the opening I'd made for her, spitting foul Nyx water. Another cultist ran at us, sword high like a banner, but before Pointy could halve him, Nilith was already battering him with her gold and copper fists, until he was a moaning wreck on the stone. His sword was wrenched from his grasp and swiftly driven through his head. "Now I'm fucking angry," Nilith rasped at me, seething from every pore. Danib was cleaving a path through any that stood in his way, on purpose or accidentally. Ghosts deliquesced in clouds and shredded pieces of armour, screaming bodies flew in great arcs across the plaza or collided with the black tusks of the Nixwell. All the while, Danib's white eyes burned for us. "He's had Khalid, he's had Etain, and now he wants you and me." "I think it's mostly you," Nilith snapped. As two dead soldiers fell in heaps at our feet, Nilith and I swiftly parted as Periseth came crashing down between us. Pointy scored a cut across Danib's shoulder before the ghost swung around with incredible speed, shearing a whisker of vapour from my head. Pointy had me rolling in a ball to avoid the vicious strikes that chased me across the stone. Sparks and chips of sandstone flew in all directions under the giant soul blade's bite. Nilith's sword cut in like the sting of a hornet, finding gaps with the copper in her blade, making the beast roar. Every time he spun to catch her, Pointy would cut in, cutting his thick steel armour to pieces wherever possible. One, maybe two we scored before Danib would jab or parry and send me running for cover. That's all I brought to the fight. Dodging and diving. Sparks showered me every time the two soul blades came together. I could almost feel their ghosts fighting through the touch of the blades, a sibling rivalry at its fiercest, each of them matching the other. With a twist of my grip that made my vambraces squeal, Pointy forced Danib's sword away and brought the blade up to cut deep under his armpit. At the same moment, Nilith drove her sword deep into his thigh with a war cry. The monster roared once more, but a gauntlet sent Nilith spinning into the stone edge of the Nixwell with a crunch of rubble. Before I could move, Danib hooked Pointy under his arm and jabbed at my defenceless midriff. Periseth made a mockery of my armour and sliced into my ribs, drawing a cry from me. It was like fire and ice, searing my vapour all at once. I yanked the sword from Danib's grip, shearing more steel from him, and cutting a chunk through his arm. I reeled away, trying to manoeuvre around the roiling masses and whirling weapons to reach Nilith. I saw the enlightened sisters standing at the edge of the dais, arms raised and hands clasped, as they watched their slaughter unfold. Behind them, the ghosts of Farazar and the Empress in waiting were struggling through the swarms of cult soldiers on the marble steps. They were trying to reach Nilith, half a broken sword and a sharp wooden stake clutched in their manacled hands. Bezel, Temza, and Hirana were dragged along with them. They watched us, rapt before our fight with the great Danib. I wondered briefly who they were hoping would die. Fucking royals. I couldn't help but think, as I fended off blow after blow. A mighty clang dulled the roar of fighting as Pointy met Periseth once more above my head. Light burst, hot metal hissed. The bell toll that ran through the blade stunned me. Once again, Pointy dragged my tiring soul back as Daneb pressed me again and again. Everywhere I moved or dodged, Daneb was upon me. My arms were shaking through striving to keep up with the ghost's speed and ferocity. Though I quailed, he only seemed to grow stronger, taller. "Caltro!" came Pointy's strained whisper. "I can't!" Between wild, windmilling swings of the soul blade, I scrabbled backwards, slipping through the muck and black water trickling over the stone. My gaze flitted about in desperation, catching another glimpse of the 3 chained ghosts. Temza was now pulling in his own direction, as was the falcon, trying to escape this madness. Hirana was damning everybody present at the top of her lungs, and Cecine was raising her shattered blade, as spears thrust away from the prone Nilith. Farazar was fighting against her now, intent on beating his daughter to the kill. Even in death, half-naked and glowing bright, I saw all their venom and rage and vengeance living on, refusing to die with their flesh. In their own ways, each had almost brought the city to its knees. Together they would have conquered the Reaches. Together. It was then I saw the threads connecting us, pulling me towards them even now. The web fate had weaved between us. Even as I riled against the notion, I saw the perfection of destiny's plan. "We can't do this alone," I snapped. Throwing myself out of Daneb's reach, I wrenched the rest of my armor from my limbs, casting it away to clang on the stone beneath me, until I stood naked and glowing brightly against the smoke and gathering darkness, soul blade in hand. The sun was now a pale disk behind the black smog that had begun to belch from the Grand Nixwell. "What are you doing?" Pointy screeched at me, trying to force me to move. Periseth was descending in an obsidian blur. "What am I supposed to do?" I yelled. Or so I hope. There was no more time for thought. I dove to the side, rolled, and began to run. I pelted towards the 3 ghosts, watching with every lunging step how Cecine's blade rose higher and higher. Enraged by my fleeing, the great ghost let loose a roar from behind me that silenced the battlefield momentarily. Daneb Ironjaw was far from finished with me. He sloshed after me through the Nyx water and corpses, covered in stone dust and blood. Blue vapour streamed from his helmet. White smoke rushed along the crossguard of the sword and down onto his wrist like a waterfall. I ran, for all my dead backside was worth. "Stay back, Caltro!" Temza's decapitated head bellowed at me, seeing me now charging at him through the melee, a mad look in my white eyes. I cut his chains as I barreled into him, loosing the falcon into the dark skies. I tensed every strand of my vapour to breaking as I pushed my soul into Temza's, dominating his will, wrapping it into mine. Within a blink I had claimed him, keeping my form and Pointy entwined with my hand. Our glow burned like a bonfire. Temza's anger filled me like ice water flooding lungs. I felt my face contort into a mask of rage. And still I ran, aiming at Hirana. As her copper chain link shattered at the kiss of my blade, I came at her with a twisted grin, half Temza's, half mine. I collided with her face first, driving myself into her cold vapours. She buckled before me, weak as a cotton strand. With a roar building in my chest, I drank in all her hate and venom. Like hot wine, it swirled within me. Farazar never saw me coming. The manacle exploded from his stump of a wrist as I threw myself at him, fusing him into my band of twisted souls before he could even yelp. A murderous fire ran through my swirling vapours. One final leap drove me into the Empress in waiting. Cecine never saw me coming until it was too late. I threw myself at her, with my arms spread-eagled, enveloping her ghost. She fought me hard, but I fed her screech of rage into my roar. Nilith's eyes burst open to find me standing over her for a fraction of a moment, arms spread, a blade in each hand, bellowing to the heavens with every inch of my lungs. The thunder of footsteps fell heavy behind me, and I poured all the raging emotion within me into Pointy. Still roaring, I threw my body into a crouch, swords arcing backwards just as Daneb lunged to grapple me. Pointy, pierced the collar of his giant breastplate, driving through his thick neck to the other side. Danib's momentum impaled him almost to the crossguard. I snarled with Temsa's ferocity and Sessine's hatred, and curled my lip with Farazar's contempt. With Hirana's callous twist, I dragged the soul blade through the remainder of Danib Ironjaw's neck. Cobalt vapour trailed behind the sword. The words fell from me unbidden. For Khalid. For your betrayal. For a moment, the ghost held his shape. Sword raised high, poised to fall upon me. Those white eyes glared at me with such ferocity, I thought for a horrifying moment the monster would never die, and then the spell of binding caught up with him, and the giant deliquesced into a thick cloud of blue vapour, rapidly fading to grey. His armour clattered to the Nixwater. Hollow, and yet the horned helmet still managed to match my stare with its black eyes. Perisef fell like a keystone, cutting a wedge from the stone as it met the ground. I convulsed as the ghosts fought me, but I wrestled them under control. I bared my teeth as emotion flooded me along with the overpowering desire to kill everything around me, even Nilith. I tensed my sword hand, keeping Pointy by my side, and focused their murderous desires on the cult of Sesh. "We have to end this," I yelled over the tumult, staring long and hard at Lyria and Yaradin. Danib's death had either escaped them, or they didn't care. They were chanting to the music of battle, calling out for their god to rise. "Sesh! Sesh! Sesh! Sesh!" Heaving Perisef from the stone, Nilith followed my gaze to the dais. "Cut the head from the snake," she said. Our soul blades spinning in blurs, Nilith and I advanced across the bloody stone. For every step we took towards the sisters, a rank of cult soldiers swarmed towards us. Nilith and Perisef on the right, Pointy and I on the left. We divided and conquered with brutal efficiency. Nothing could stand in the way of the razor-edged swords. Rows of shields were cleaved in two, sword blades and axe heads were reduced to shards. With Pointy's skill and the ferocity of the ghosts within me, I felt like an unbound ghost tethered to his body, content to be taken along for the bloody ride. My arms swung in intricate patterns an artist couldn't conceive. Clouds of blue smoke burst with every slice. Scarlet cloth scattered in ribbons. Whenever the living came against us, blood rained down. White burns adorned my naked vapours, but my rage eclipsed all pain. Nilith was a dirty fighter, wasting no time on the finesse Pointy or Invincible displayed. If he was an artist of death, Nilith was a worker slaving away with a sledgehammer. I had no complaints. It left the same amount of blood in her trail as mine. Body by body, soul by soul, we fought our way to the steps of the dais. We had no allies but each other. Even the nobles around us were too busy fighting their own battles. Between parries and blocks I watched, but it gave me no pleasure to see the rich murdered like the poor, as much as I had expected it to. This massacre was a horror, powerful or peasant, dead or alive. The cult had brought about their flood all right, a flood of chaos and murder. And Nixwater. The oily water was rising, now spilling down the Nixwell's amphitheatre steps. It blackened the white stone wherever it touched. Nilith and I sloshed through a rising pool of it as we battled our way free of the press and wail of bodies. Snarling, growling, more irate by the moment, I pushed ahead, carving a path that Nilith could keep open long enough to trail me. Through it all, my head swiveled about like a paranoid owl's, aching to spot an open stretch of stone. Transfixed by the sight of a swarm of naked souls pouring through a barricade, I stumbled and fell over a corpse at my feet. My coin came dangerously to touching the water, and I leapt back. But the water wasn't for me. It was for the bodies around me. I saw them beginning to smoke where the Nixwater lapped them. Some were already disappearing, slipping beneath the waters as if they had fallen into a deep trench in the stone. Between the roiling masses fighting and dying, I glimpsed red-robed shades drenched in black splotches, busy dragging bodies out of their piles and spreading them through the wash of Nixwater. I couldn't help but imagine the hordes of bodies finding themselves adrift in that bleak cavern they called afterlife, flooded with dark waters. Clang! Pointy rose up before my face. The offender's sword split on Pointy's blade. and its pieces scored cuts across my cheeks. I barely flinched, too busy gawping with the realization of what the cult's sacrifice was for. Not for vengeance or some sadistic justice, but for Sesh. The dead god's words rushed back to me. The flood must not claim the world. Don't let the river burst. Life will become death. I saw 5 stars blink out in the black firmament. The harbinger of change, I breathed. "What?" Pointy yelled, maneuvering me to skewer a charging soldier. I impaled him and his comrade on the same thrust. "This way!" I let the ghosts within drive me, like holding the reins of mad horses. Nilith tried to keep up, bleeding in a dozen places and currently grappling with a shade in heavy battle armor. His mace was digging into her scalp. Pointy cut through his arms in one swipe, sending him to the Nyx water with a squeal and splash. They're not sparking a revolt. They're flooding the afterlife, bursting the Nyx's banks. It'll flood the earth with every ghost that's ever died. No living thing will survive it, and Sesh will rule over an empire of the dead, I cried, hearing the souls within me rail at the notion. Ghostly fingers tried to pry their way out of my vapours. "Treason!" Cecine's voice sprang from me, and I forced them into silence. Nilith looked around, witnessing the same pandemonium I did. Tens of thousands were now pitched in a desperate losing battle against the ranks of cultists that continued to stream through the barricades. We had both seen the swollen tears of the Caltro Basalt. Who knew how many more cultists and cathedrals on their heads lay under the districts and the sprawls? In the brief moments our eyes met between our sword dances, the word hopeless lay between us, and all the while barrel after barrel was hacked open and spilled upon the plaza. "I didn't survive the desert just to die at the Grand Nyx well," Nilith snarled. "It's already starting to happen," yelled Pointy. In pockets of stillness between the murderous fighting, where corpse piles slowly melted into the Nyx, I saw groping hands and glowing fingers reaching from the sloshing waters. Hellish in their grasping, soul by soul they began to crawl through the corpses. Wherever the injured lay, ghostly hands reached for throats, rocks, daggers. 1,000 years trapped in an endless, godless cavern tended to make a soul irritable. Murderous. I looked back to the Nyx well where the river was now bubbling like an overheated pot. Where the smoke gathered thickest, veins of lightning and fire ran through the darkness. I saw more hands and gurning faces at the edges of the overflowing well. The old religious types say the apocalypse will come with the sound of trumpets and horns. When I heard the mournful blares over the battle noise, I hung my head and cursed myself for doubting them. "Look!" Nilith wrenched me around by the shoulders. To the west, a wall of barrels exploded in fountains of splinters and Nyx water. Through it came a monster I had never seen the like of, and I immediately wish I hadn't. It was an enormous centipede, striped black and purple, with reaching, hook-like claws around its fearsome head. Mandibles lined with needle fangs dribbled green spit. A rider sat atop its neck, strapped tightly into a saddle. The huge insect reared up, legs rippling in a mesmerizing fashion, and screeched at the top of its lungs. As the chilling noise filled the plaza, 2 more of the monsters broke through the wreckage to join the first. They, too, had riders atop them. I could feel the moan of the dwindling survivors as a wind on my cheek. Nilith had turned an ashen white. "Dune worms," she breathed, voice trembling. "Flee, you moron!" Temsa bellowed within my ear. Hirana's broken hands groped for my neck. "I will not die twice because of you, Caltro Basalt!" I pressed them deeper within me, feeling the strain of the haunting begin to tell. Pointy's force within me was an ally, but it didn't help that I agreed somewhat strongly with the ghosts. The only thing that kept me from running was the fact that creatures weren't interested in the living, nor the fleeing, but merely anything wearing red. Cultists flew like chaff before the scythe as the monsters went to work destroying their phalanxes. Through the smoke that had enveloped the plaza, I caught the glint of green and silver armor. Soldiers were pouring through the broken barricade. There were plumes on their rigid helmets and glittering longswords and tridents held high. Triggermen, with sacks of bolts, sat atop armoured spiders, whose fangs tore at anything robed and dead. Men in robes of mail heaved against shrieking, slithering creatures on copper-linked leashes. Slathergasts, like the one Nilith had killed. They were as pale and slimy as month-old meat. They disturbed me greatly, but their shining blue claws and fangs had an unquenchable thirst for anything glowing, and they decimated the cultist ranks. More wonderful still, the citizens that had been kept at bay began to flow into the plaza alongside the mysterious soldiers, like villagers with pitchforks marching to the monster's cave. "Who the fuck are they?" I cried as Pointy dispatched a scarlet-painted man with a knife. "I don't care, but they are most welcome." The arrival of the golden green ranks was a glowing dawn compared to this gruesome night that had consumed us. The citizens of Araxes seemed to feel it, and the grip of chaos began to break. Even the nobles began to stand side by side, forming battalions that duelled with endless swarms of ghosts. I threw a glance over my shoulder, challenging the sisters. Their grins made me wish I hadn't looked. "It's not over yet," I cursed. Another horn was sounded in reply, high-pitched and ululating. Glowing streaks ran across the walls of the plaza to the south as gangs of naked ghosts clumped around the towering knight statues, 3 with scaffolding and huge glyphs chiseled across them. Vapour pressing across the stone, the ghosts started to fade into the statues, and in their dozens. Peering through the haze of smoke, I began to see the glyphs and veins in the stone glow a deep purple, then turquoise, then white. Stone chips crumbled away. Cracks appeared where its limbs began to move. Fresh screams of terror rose from the masses. Are you fucking kidding me?" Nilith sighed heavily, hefting a spear at a nearby ghost and turning him into a blue cloud. "Now this." Though I was as shocked and gut-wrenched as her, at least I had an answer. "The cult's strange ranks. I'm not the only ghost with gifts, Nilith. It's an endgame." Thunder rolled with every wrenching, twisting movement that got the stone knights to their feet. Prizing their swordstones from the earth, they wasted no time in swinging them through the masses like a callous artist splashing scarlet on a bleak canvas. The screams were silenced in huge numbers, replaced with great rumbles of stone and breaking bones. With every sweeping blow, the ground shook beneath us and lightning flickered overhead. "Ever come up against this in all your decades, Pointy?" I cried, desperate. "No," he replied. "Suggestions?" "Few," said Nilith, sagging with weariness. "At least these swords can cut through stone. And I have this," she said, pulling a pouch from around her neck. "A coin purse?" I spluttered. We had little time to debate the issue. A roar from the flooded pit of the Nyx well wrenched us around. A great mushroom of smoke belched from the well. I saw a great shadow without form rearing up within the billowing smog, reaching for the dais. Ghosts reared from the waters in droves, wailing at the top of their voices. Unholy shapes moved in the shadows behind them, the ghost glow lighting only fangs and curling claws. Older things that the Reachers had long forgotten. The earth slipped beneath us, making me stumble. Fell and foreign words filled the air. I looked up, meeting Nilith's wide gaze. The determination that had burned within them since the moment I had run into her should have been sputtering out. A lantern withering under the gales of a storm, like me, even despite the anger threatening to burst out of me. Instead, I swore those eyes burned brighter. I wanted it. "More," I hissed. "Don't you dare," chorused the 3 ghosts inside me. My restraint almost failed as they revolted against me. I plucked the half-coins from my neck and stuffed them into her hand. "What are you doing?" "I'm sorry, Nilith," I said, seizing her glowing arm and throwing Pointy into the air. "What?" The effort brought darkness to my vision, even before my vapours had melted into her. It was a duel that took every ounce of strength I had. Each soul fought me in their own way, and I found myself surrounded on all sides, lashing out like a rabid beast at them all. Even Nilith. But as I willed myself through bone and skin, through the heat of her muscles, the cold of her sweat, Nilith caved, and an inferno erupted within me. I opened my eyes, dizzy, as I reached up to pluck Pointy from the sky. His vapours flooded across Nilith's armour, and every inch of my body began to convulse. White light shone through her armour. I felt the raw power of each soul entwine, willingly or not, each a piece of clockwork clicking into place. In that moment, we became complete. The cultists roared around us. Sesh! 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 I stared up at the burning sky. As lightning raced through the billowing black smoke, I saw a mighty figure pulling itself from the pit. Fire flowed through its limbs, like wind breathing life into charcoal. 2 enormous orbs of light flared in the darkness. The earth quaked as the black tusks of the Nixwell began to topple outwards, like a colossal yawning maw. One crashed behind me, spraying Nix water and screaming bodies. The voices in my head were deafening, but I willed us towards the nearest stone knight, pouring everything into one singular drive. To win. I sprinted through the knobs of ghosts, soul blades held wide and dealing death all around us with shocking ferocity. Mist fought to escape the confines of the golden armour, sketching shapes of arms and hands and roaring faces. White fire and blood streamed behind us. We were a whirlwind of rage and vengeance. "Caltro!" came their cry as the stone knight noticed our approach and raised its gigantic sword to smite us. Light rippled across its glyphs, and its rock face bent into a despicable grin. I let their cries rip from me as my boots pounded the flooded stone. 100 voices answered me as the sword descended, lungs burning. I exploded from Nilith's chest, soul blazed raised like javelins, vapour streamed like a banner behind me as Temza, Hirana, and Sissine were wrenched from me one by one, propelling me like a trigger-bow bolt into the knight's chest. Stone crumbled before the 2 blades as they dug deep. I dug deeper, pressing through the glowing breastplate and straight to the heart of the stone monster. Countless hands battered me within the roaring darkness, but like Nilith, I hadn't come all this way to lose now. I felt my own heaviness, the roughness of my fingers, and clenched them into a fist. White light seared through the air, burning the cult ghosts from the knight's body. Blue smoke poured from its cracks like volcanic vents. I alone was left inside the crushing cold stone, dizzy at my height above the writhing masses. But I was its master. I couldn't help but cheer. My voice was the roar of a landslide. I saw the darkness of the Nixwell rear above me. Fire burned in the heavens. Thunder rolled and lightning showed me a great beast towering against the storm, still yet to take solid shape. It was enough to chill me. Gigantic, twisting horns pierced the sky. Great wolf fangs gleamed. Nails like lances tested the choked air. Its forge-like eyes seethed with anger as they looked down upon me, as if I were but a worm. "Caltro!" came the tiny shout beneath me. With another rumbling cry, I slid the huge Periseph from my chest with my oversized hands and drove the stone knight at the Nixwell. I stumbled, fell, but forced the stone upright over and over. Sesh rose above me still. A great booming laughter dwarfed the thunder and stunned all about me to a horrified silence. I alone moved, and my enormous feet cracked the flagstones beneath me as I ran. "It's over, little thief," came a voice that made every pebble in my body rattle. "You're right about that," I cried as I vaulted over the rubble, sword raised like a dagger in my fist, its glimmering point aimed for Sesh's calf. Periseph slammed into the god's brimstone skin. Fire and black smoke erupted from the wound, lava dribbled, and still I drove the sword deeper. Light scorched his veins, soaring up his leg and across his chest. His roar made the very ground dance. I could feel the soul in the sword screaming as her blade melted. With a twist, Periseph came free, broken to the hilt and smoking. Above me, Sesh was still bellowing, reeling from the pain. Wings of fire and lightning rippled across the dark clouds. "Again, Caltro!" came a voice from my chest. Pointy was yelling at me over the maelstrom. "Strike him again!" Didn't you see what happened to your sister? I shouted, drawing him free. He looked like a nail in my stone fist. I stared at the resolute face on his pommel stone. You still have one soul blade left. Horror ran through me like an assassin's dagger. No, you'll be destroyed. Stand back. Nilith came wading across the shaking, flooded stone behind me. She had a knife in her hand, that infernal pouch in the other. That determined fire was back in her wide eyes, unable to tear away from the sight of a god. There's no time, Pointy pleaded. I refused to listen. I felt him tugging at my arm, but I wrenched him back. Fire spat upon my stone, starting to work its way through the glowing glyphs. Pain racked me. I'm the only weapon that can hurt him. Even you can't haunt a god, yelled the sword. I hated him for being right. The darkness was returning to my vision. I was spent. I won't. I can't. Stand back, Nilith shrieked, throwing the pouch into the bubbling fire that still poured from Sesh. For old Fen! Just make sure they remember me. That was all I ever wanted in truth. Pointy whispered in my head. In the flash of fire and lightning, I swore I saw him wink. To be remembered. The right thing can be an evil thing when it doesn't align with what you want. With a last roar, I threw my weight behind his blade and thrust him high into Sesh's leg, dragging him down through the charred, smoking flesh. White light began to pierce through holes in the god's midriff, chest and shoulders as Pointy's soul flooded him. Flame poured from the eyes of the god of chaos. Before the explosion ripped through me, before my hand was torn from Pointy's handle, I heard his battle cry, echoing and echoing through the dark and empty cavern of my mind. I knew not what he shouted, but I knew Sesh heard it also. One of the last sights I glimpsed was the god grasping at his curling horns as if deafened. A sledgehammer struck me in the chest as the world was consumed with fire. I fell apart as I flew, stone crumbling to rubble. I was jolted from the haunting violently as I hit the water and skidded through the corpses. Heat scorched my back, and I felt the pull of the dark Nyx beneath me. Chapter 27. A Second Dawn. Get up, spoke an echo in my head. I could smell burning crumbs from the bakers across the pockmarked street. Hear the clatter of cleaning in the cat house above. The linens refused to give me up, and I willingly let them hold me as rays of red sunlight poked through my window, warming my cheeks, nursing my hangover, and the dream of battle and murder I'd been trapped in. A new day awaits, said the voice, familiar in some way. I know, came my mumble. Harbinger of change. I jolted upright and awake, immediately blinded by the hot sun poking through dark clouds. Rashes of sunset were breaking through patches of smoke. I clenched my fists, feeling nothing but cold. No skin, no hot breath against covers. Only vapor. Ah, the Emperor wakes, somebody beside me said. I tried opening my eyes again, finding a woman's corpse facing me with a bulging, glassy stare. I recoiled, quickly, finding blackened sandstone and rubble around me. Puddles of Nyx water steamed in the sunlight, leaving behind rings of charcoal smear. Emperor. 2 filthy half-coins dangled in front of my face, on 2 different chains. Yours, aren't they? My blurry vision cleared enough to find a soot-covered, blood-soaked Nilith staring back at me. Her armor had been stripped away, leaving a simple tunic beneath. Half her jaw had been claimed by vapor, giving her a ghostly leer. Most of her other arm, too. Those emerald eyes seemed to glow a little more dully now, but there was a grim and stubborn smile on her face. I reached up to take the coins, but realized I still gripped something in my hand. I looked down, finding a broken sword, molten almost to the silver crossguard. Only a thin shard of the obsidian and copper-veined blade, no longer than my hand, had survived, daring to strike a god. The handle was split down its centre, as was the pommel where the black stone was spider-webbed with cracks. My face scrunched up, but I had no tears to give. Instead, I took the coins in my other hand. One felt cold and heavy. The other stung me like a hot coal. But I had survived enough pain in the last few weeks to ignore it. I saw Nilith swallow hard, but I said nothing. I lifted my head and arched my back, moving as far away from my corpse mattress as possible. I stumbled to my knees, then 1 foot, feeling weak, thin as gossamer, but whole. We survived. I breathed, hardly believing it. But at what cost, Caltro? I looked around me. The Grand Nixwell was a ruin. Its jet tusks lay in pieces like the points of a fallen star. The well was no more than its crater, an ugly mess of broken marble, half drowned in a pool of Nyx water. Around it lay the detritus of war, ownerless weapons, split armour, and the thousands of dead that the Nyx had yet to claim. Taurs, farmers, serriks, and soldiers lay alongside each other in death, gold mingling with sackcloth, and as my gaze roamed outwards into the plaza, I saw they were far from alone. Fields of dead stretched out between us and the hazy smoke-wrapped buildings. Scattered survivors, living and ghost, moved slowly amongst them, plodding with heads down, their tunics or silks ripped and torn. Nobody seemed to know what to do with their survival, and I didn't blame them. The hot air was still but not silent. In the far reaches of the plaza, in the spoke avenues, I could hear the battle for the city wasn't over. But I had no desire to go fight it. I left that to the ranks of silver-green soldiers and the spiders and worms still growling and roaring. There came a flapping, and the talking falcon landed on a corpse next to me. By the curve of his beak, I wagered he was no more impressed by the scene than I was. "Only stubborn stragglers left, Nilith," he said, eyeing me up and down. There was blood on his beak. I interjected. "The rest of the cult?" Nilith nodded, gaze now distant, ignoring the falcon. Half of them put their weapons down the moment Sesh collapsed back into the Nyx. The rest fought on, enraged, but the soldiers and survivors retaliated and fought them back into the avenues. Most have scattered to the wind. The enlightened sisters? Nilith's eyes narrowed. Dead. Or so I assume. They stood upon the dais until the bitter end, so I can only hope the explosion caught them. I dreaded to think of those two scuttling back to the Catra Rasan, burying their heads for another day. "What was in that fucking pouch of yours?" I asked. "Science," a man once called it. "Well, it was almost the second death of me," I swayed, dizzy. "Is nobody going to talk about the fact a dead god just rose from the Grand Nixwell, shortly before you two killed him?" asked the falcon, golden eyes narrowed. "Or was I hallucinating?" Nilith and I looked at each other for a moment. "No," I spoke for us. "I'd rather not. It's done now. I'm tired of gods. If I ever have to see hide or hair of one again, it'll be far too soon," I sighed. "What of the others? Sessine, Hirana, Temza?" All I could see was Farazar hunched over on a nearby rock, unable to tear his eyes off the death around him. With the explosion and with Sesh crumbling to the ground, dozens of souls were caught in his path. Nilith showed me 3 more half-coins in her bloody palm, turned stained and grey. "I never got to speak to my daughter again," she said, her voice hollow. I had hoped she would have understood. "She will," I said, "in the afterlife." It was the only comfort I could give her. Nilith wiped her bloody nose. "Hirana is also gone. Temza somehow survived, like the cockroach he is. He'll get what's coming to him." "What's next, then? Besides gutting the cult's cathedral?" asked the falcon. It was a heavy and cumbersome question, one I certainly had no answer for. I was still too preoccupied with merely standing up. "That is the great question, isn't it, Bezel?" she sighed. "Almost as great as how you did it, Caltro." "Did what?" "How you brought us all together at the last minute. How you made a monster out of all that rage and anger and fear. How did you do it?" I smiled, looking up at the sky once more. You're the one who told me of fate, Nilith. You should know better than I do. Dead God's will or luck, every one of us, villain or hero, came together, here at the final hour. That was by some design, not an accident. I should know. I've spent my entire life working out the designs of smarter minds. Nilith opened her mouth to question me, but closed it as she saw a throng of soldiers making their way across the battlefield. Survivors reached out to touch their shields and cloak hems, but they were poked aside with long poles just as firmly as the corpses underfoot. I could see two figures at the center of their formation, and what looked like a horse. One was a woman in black cloth, hobbling. The other was a noble-looking man, swaddled in armor so fine and intricate it somehow looked fit enough attire for a ballroom. His hair was an oily stripe across his bald, tanned skull. I recognized the woman somehow, but I didn't know how. There was a keen, ever-roaming look in her eye that guards and people of the law tended to have. It made the thief in me wary. "Empress," called the woman, and the soldiers parted either side of us. By the dead fucking gods! Helles! Nilith embraced the woman warmly, if stiffly given the number of wounds and bruises both of them sported. I wasn't far behind them, with white lines crisscrossing my naked glowing body. Helles. I knew that name. Nilith pushed past the soldiers to the horse, Anoish. The poor beast was missing one ear, was crisscrossed with lacerations, and was limping sorely, but like his mistress, there was a glint in his chestnut eyes that was long for the grave. Nilith pressed her forehead to the horse's nose for the briefest of moments. "This is your doing?" The Empress was breathless, as if she abruptly recognized the armor around her. Helles didn't reply, transfixed by the patch of vapor around Nilith's throat and jaw. "Somewhat," replied the woman. "When Joby took me instead of you, I thought I'd see if I could make you some allies." "What? So who are you?" Nilith asked of the noble. She seemed agitated and almost crumpled to her knees when another man appeared between the soldiers, covered in silks and gold chains. "No." Nilith began to cry, but both men raised their hands. The noble introduced himself with a stiff bow, barely more than a nod. He, too, was held wrapped by the glowing jawbone and black flesh around Nilith's neck. "Director Raspanar, if you please. I represent the consortium, and I might be able to offer an explanation. After Chaser Joby brought Scrutinizer Helles to us, mistaking her for you, she informed us of your intentions to bring change to Araxes. A change that we were most interested in helping you to achieve. The consortium voted in favor of standing by you, but as we arrived to do precisely that, we saw the massacre underway. We are businessmen, Empress, and though the cost has been great—" Raspanar paused to look around at the wreckage of the plaza. "We wager the reward to be most profitable." Nilith had not taken her eyes off Joby. "And my so-called debt?" "Forgotten, in exchange for your favor. As is Scrutinizer Helles, who wagered her life against your success here today. The consortium are not the threat you believe we are. We can be of great use to you, Empress, and it appears you need our help now more than ever. That is, if such chaos has not deterred your thirst for the throne." Nilith raised her chin. "I have every intention of ruling, Director. I fought for this city thus far. I refuse to abandon it now, even if there is little of it left to rule," she said. "But I'm afraid you're not speaking to the ruler of this empire." Raspanar looked immediately flustered. "What?" "This here is the Emperor," Nilith sighed, pointing a shaky hand at me, still taking a knee in the dirt. "After all, it's he who holds Farazar's half-coin. He's the one that saved Araxes. Hell, maybe even the Reaches. I was the one who trusted the cult. We all trusted them." I ground out the words. "That's what they do. They use trust as a weapon, preying on desperation and desire until they're right behind you with a knife." I felt all eyes turn on me, even those of the stoic consortium soldiers. All I did was cradle the Emperor's coin in my hand, letting it burn against my vapors and send white sparks shooting across my fingers. With much effort, I stood upon my weak legs. How the fuck did I get here? I asked myself, but found no answer in my head. The silence pained me. I wished for Pointy's voice, my surrogate conscience, From thief to emperor. My parents, dead gods rest them, might have been proud of me, even if this was the most sordid, sprawling empire on earth. And now a broken-hearted one, its soul poisoned. Once more, my gaze wandered over the plaza, lit with a copper hue by the sun slipping between the western buildings. Above us, amidst the last wisps of smoke and ash in the east, powder blue sky clung on to the last moments of daylight. Brushstrokes of high cloud turned to fire, like funeral pyres for the dying sun. The countless spires and towers were visible now. I'd almost forgotten how many poked at the sky, and how far they stretched into the burning horizon. It would be a feat to count them, never mind rule them. Even the notion of such responsibility began to crush me with the weight of the cloud-piercer. In the short time we had stood there, the injured and the lost had already begun to gather about us. Their hollow eyes looked for a saviour or answers, even somebody to blame. I was a son of the crass steppes, a healer's son. I was a thief, a locksmith, probably the finest in the known world. I had survived death, played the game of Araxes and won, been begged by the god of gods and of late even become a hero to some. And yet, I could be no emperor. My fight had not been for the throne, but for justice and freedom, and I had those. Trust me, I said, holding the half-coin up to the sunlight to stare at it, wondering, just like everybody present, how exactly it had ended up in my hands. I sighed. I'd do a horrible job. Instead of a city of ghosts and murderers, you'd likely have a city of drunkards and thieves. Nilith cracked a half-dead smile. You can always count on a craftsman to tell you exactly what he's thinking. Your sharp tongue has brought you this far, Caltro Basalt. May it keep you safe a little longer. With that, I handed Nilith her coin and washed my glowing hands of it. I looked around at the battered Helles, the squinting, suspicious Raspanar, and the soldiers flanking us. Speaking of drunkards, I asked, is it me, or does anybody else fancy a cold beer? 2 days had passed since the Battle of Araxes. Though the city survived, it had been wounded, almost mortally so. It had curled in upon itself like a dying hound. The streets remained empty but for the consortium soldiers, workers, and corpse piles. Towers stayed sealed, doors remained firmly locked and barred. Trade ships lingered in the bay of the troublesome sea, unwilling to dock amidst such rumours of madness. Even the parrots and rooks and pigeons seemed subdued. They must have felt it too, the same as every soul left in the city. The scent of death still hung heavy in the air. No matter how fast the workers tried to clear the bodies away and surrender them to the shattered Grand Nixwell, with every passing day the sun beat down, it grew fouler and fouler. 50,000 so far. Still climbing, they said. And still no ghosts arose from the dead. With Sesh destroyed, Araxes had no argument over Nilith's banishment of the code. The Nyx had begun to flow once more, but to everybody's abject surprise, in the opposite direction. It remained the river of the afterlife, it seemed, but without the power of binding. Not a soul market had opened its doors since the battle, and not a soul had been bound. The Nyxites had disbanded seemingly overnight once they realized the hold of copper over a corpse had crumbled. Word had it thousands of ghosts were gathering at Nixwells across the city to drown their coins and claim the afterlife. As despicable as it sounded, the cult's flood of chaos had helped turn Araxes against the Nyx. Even Pharazar, offered banishment or the afterlife by Nilith, had chosen the new afterlife. The promise of Duat that had been missing for 1,000 years. Only Boran Temza was not given such a choice. Nilith had decided the Cloud-Piercer dungeons were the best place for him. A private cell, where he could spend the years in darkened silence, lacking sleep, sensation, and forever cold, just like all the ghosts he'd bound and traded over the years. He'd been far from happy with that sentence. I'd taken some pleasure in watching his rage melt to horror, as Nilith had swung the cell door shut. It was a fitting end for the scourge of Araxes. It appeared the cult's flood had spread further across the city than just the Grand Nixwell. I was told the chamber had been practically destroyed. Half the Nyxite warehouses too. even a dozen banks of Oshirim district. Soulstealer gangs in the outsprawls had been crushed. Even the consortium had been attacked on some level. But no more. The surviving cultists had been chased as far as the dune plains. The Caltro Basalt had been broken open and filled with boiling oil and rubble by a vengeful army of citizens. A torrent of red clothes had filled the skies and gutters on the first day as every scrap of the despicable colour had been ousted by noble and urchin alike. The pyres of charred cloth still smoked here and there amongst the streets. I'd watched it all from the balconies and broken windows of the Cloudpiercer. 2 days had passed, and still I had not left the tower, ruined and strewn with corpses as it was. Instead, I had roamed its endless floors and its many vacant rooms. I played thief for myself for the first time since arriving in Araxes, plucking at abandoned lockboxes and drawers in my boredom and uselessness. This new future of the Arctian Empire had no use for me, despite how many times Nilith tried to tell me otherwise. 2 days, and the new Empress Nilith had not yet slept. Perhaps it was the Slatherghast poison finally claiming her, or perhaps this was what a dutiful ruler looked like, and it was so unusual as to be foreign to me. In either case, plans, scrolls, maps, and books had been ferried back and forth from the Empress's rooms. Survivors of this chamber and that came running. Even scrutinizers and proctors that had survived the cult's knives came to join the new Empress's cause. Within a day, Nilith had built herself a new court and galvanized it into turning the city around. I would have been impressed if it hadn't exhausted me just watching it from doorways. Rumours of our feats had spread through the survivors, district by district. Talk of Nilith, at least. The city was afire with tales of the warrior empress, the dead queen, the codebreaker, the saviour of Araxes. I was glad. Immensely so. I could have felt spurned and demanded my glory. But I now knew my worth. I didn't need hushed whispers and low bows, and gladly left that to Nilith and Helles. Even the looks I received from some of the survivors, those who had seen me on the battlefield, were too much for a thief like me. I've always belonged in the shadows, wearing a hood rather than a medal. So it was that I had taken to hiding in the Cloud Court, away from gossip of ghosts, breaking through stone knights, and the man who had finally killed Danib Ironjaw. I stared at the turquoise throne with my head cocked, eyeing how it changed colour depending where the sun fell. I was surprised it had survived the crash of the Vengeance, still lying in pieces up against the walls of the court. I reached out a finger and ran it across the glassy stone, feeling nothing and making no sound. The dust spiraled behind my touch, wafting in the soft breezes coming through the broken ceiling. It took me another hour to lift a foot onto its pedestal and climb its short steps. It was firm but numb to my vapours. I rested my backside against its cold surface and sat back with my arms stretched, looking out over the broken marble and shattered columns. Terrible view, I said aloud. Wouldn't you agree? 2 days, and I had yet to place Pointy down, never mind let go of him. Hope still clung on within me. I lifted up the tortured blade as I spoke, staring into its warped metal and longing for an answer. None came, and once again the angst welled up inside me with no way of getting it out, besides roaring at the skies. I'd tried that. It wasn't effective. I shuffled around, trying to find a good position, but it was useless. Good luck, Nilith. Your ass is going to need it, I sighed. I pushed myself up, catching the stone with the broken sword as I left the throne. Even as a shard, the blade still managed to score a scratch in the turquoise. I half-turned to leave promptly, but caught myself as I saw the glyphs of names sprawling along stone. An idea blossomed. I reached out with the blade again and made another cut, and another, etching simple runes into the stone. Crass by name, crass by nature, perhaps. But how often do you get to carve your name into a throne? Especially one as glorious and spectacularly uncomfortable as this one. The door thudded as it opened, spilling sunlight through the shadows, and I saw Helles framed in its arch. She had my phantom dog by her side, rescued from the cathedral on its head before it was destroyed. I stood up, brushing down my smock of grey and gold. Empress wants to see you. It's time to decide what to do with the ghosts. Helles looked suspicious as I approached, eyeing the blade in my hand. What have you been doing? She asked. Nothing, I said, running my vapours over the phantom's blue ears. Regretting your decision already, Caltro? Like I said, it's not my throne, Chamberlain. Correct, it's not. I pushed past her, moving to the grand windows that had been barred and barricaded against errant flying machines. Little had changed since I last looked. Even from high up in the cloud piercer, I could feel the city longing to relax. To let go. As do I. Tell her I'll be right along, Helles. As you wish, Majesty. Helles stalked off, the sharp folds of her chamber uniform snapping as she walked. I narrowed my eyes and clutched my half-coin around my neck.
Death was a deplorable sensation. No heartbeat within her chest, no breath wheezing in and out, no heat on her skin from the sunlight that bathed her, no skin to speak of at all. The Slathergast's poison had finally claimed her. The wind toyed with her vapours as Nilith stared out over Araxes, her vision blurring at the edges. The city's noises were few and dull, just the occasional call of a rook or the racing flutter of a flock of doves. Nilith had never heard Araxes so quiet, even at night. She shivered in the cold. Always cold. Part of her longed for the baking heat of the dune plains on her back one last time. The falcon by her side cleared his throat. They're here. Nilith bowed her head, pressing it to the cold stone. I suppose I can't put it off any longer, can I? I don't think you can, Basalt replied. And to be honest, I wish you wouldn't. I'm not the only ghost awaiting your judgment. Nilith straightened, looking out over the city's spires. You killed my daughter, Basalt. By all rights, I should have you kept in a box for another 100 years as punishment. You aren't the type of... Aren't I? Nilith felt her glowing eyes flash bright as she stared down at the falcon. A fierce moment passed between them. However, she said, voice sharp but level, we are here now, and whatever steps were taken to get here were taken exactly as they should have been. I would not change the past to look over a different future now. As much as the mother in me screams to throttle you, I will give you your freedom as I promised, Basalt. Your death, if you still want it. From under her turquoise robes, she produced the slender silver bell. Its edged feathers caught the afternoon sun. The falcon fluttered his wings. He lowered his head to the stone and closed his eyes. I will never forget your kindness. Nilith rested a hand on his feathers. Nor I yours, Basalt. The falcon shrugged his bony shoulders and clacked his beak. Who knows? Why be so fucking hasty? The afterlife isn't going anywhere, thanks to you. Maybe I'll give those dead gods a chance to stock up on wine and whores before I arrive. Nilith grinned. Empress, said a voice. Helles stood behind them. No rest for the dead, Nilith whispered before sweeping from the balcony and into the shadow of her chambers. Basalt followed, swooping down from the railing onto a nearby set of antelope horns. Chamberlain, have the banks surrendered their half-coins yet? Nilith inquired. Most, not all. I have scrutinizers seeing to the rest of them. Flimsy seems to think the battle didn't happen. Fool. Explain it to him again, would you? Nilith moved about the copse of tables she'd spread her maps over. She was momentarily mesmerized by the scrawls of ink. Everything all right, Nilith? Asked Helles. The Empress took some time to nod. There is so much to do, she muttered. You should know better than anyone that saving an empire isn't supposed to be easy, Helles answered, flicking a crumb from a nearby scroll. Nilith had to smile at that. I should, shouldn't I? She said, unclenching her fists. Where's Caltro? I want to talk about his ceremony. It's time the citizens of this city knew who saved them. Helles waved a hand at the ceiling, in the general direction of the cloud court. Said he'd be along shortly. Not good enough. I haven't the time to be waiting on that locksmith. In no time at all, Nilith swept from the room, vapours and silks trailing. The scimitar at her hip jangled in its ivory scabbard. Basalt flapped alongside them. They ascended to the chambers beneath the cloud court, and up again to the mighty golden door of the hall itself. With a creak, the door surrendered to Nilith's push, and they entered the sunlit wreckage of the hall. The shafts fell across piles of rubble and the burnt shell of Harana's flying machine. The turquoise throne glowed with its own light, sea green under sun, deep sapphire in shadow. Where is he? Caltro! Nilith called to the silent hall. Only the wind replied, murmuring across the jagged glass of the smashed skylights. The falcon flitted between the remaining columns, looking for the ghost. Where is that damn locksmith? She asked of Helles. But the scrutinizer had no answer, merely shrugging. No sign of him! They poked around the rubble, but no glow presented itself. Nilith checked behind the throne with an irritated growl, and it was then she noticed the scrap of papyrus lying on the seat of the throne and the fresh powder of turquoise glass at its feet. There above it, the names Caltro Basalt and Absia had been carved in the stone in crass runes. Like it or not, the smile began to spread across her face. Nilith snatched up the papyrus, ripping its fold open. More runes awaited her. We make our own luck. Nilith held the note in her hand, and with some concentration, crumpled it in a blue fist. Helles came closer, concerned. What is it? What has he done? Nothing, Helles. Caltro has simply done what he's wanted to all along. He's gone home. But what about the... It'll be fine, Nilith interrupted. She threw the papyrus to the ground and put her heel upon it. When she raised her head, the smile had grown into a grin. He'll be just fine.
A moonless night and empty streets made the going easy, swift. The phantom by my side was true to his name, and silent. I saw soldiers at most junctures, but they were more interested in helping with the corpse piles to notice me flitting through dark alleys. Though the robe covered most of me, I tensed to keep my glow to a faint shine. I could do nothing about the whining from inside the big sack I carried, but I had no choice in that matter. The city was wary of any ghost that skulked about, and rightly so. The shard of pointy sat at my side. Invincible I'd taken to calling him. It had a more fitting ring for a god-killing blade, dead or not. As I crept between the bluffs of mighty warehouses and grain silos, I saw fallen bodies here and there between the gutters. Though I'd seen more than enough in my time in Araxes, I couldn't help but stare at their twisted postures and gaunt faces. I hunkered down behind a barrel as a set of consortium soldiers came tramping past. As I waited there, listening to the rhythm of their boots, I put my hand on something soft. I recoiled to find a corpse beside me, grinning with a dislodged jaw. I wrinkled my lip, and as I pulled away, its foggy eyes swiveled in their shallow sockets to look at me. The contents of my sack began to growl. I should have known I hadn't seen the last of you, I said with a sigh. The corpse had no words for me. I stood and scurried on, darting down another side street towards the docks. Always towards the docks. It had taken me several hours to get this far, and I was only just glimpsing the black blanket of the sea between the canyon streets. Every corpse in my path began to turn their head or dared gaze to face me as I passed them. The fresher ones, those still with lips the rats hadn't got to yet, whispered at me. Caltro. Thank you, one called, its eyes glowing green for the briefest of moments. You did as we asked. A black cat, half its skin missing and bearing grey ribs on one side, scampered across my path. "You saved us," it hissed. "And you better remember it," I whispered back, though I wondered how many puppet strings they had pulled besides my own. How much manoeuvring had they done behind the scenes of this catastrophic play? I ran faster still. I longed to put this city, its gods and its corpses behind me. Dead though I was crass, and that was where I belonged. A land I knew and trusted. I'd given the dead gods what they wanted. They could furnish me with peace and quiet from now on. Yet still the eyes watched me. Still the whispers of gratitude and congratulations followed me. As I passed piles of corpses, whole choruses would wheeze my name. It was intolerable, until, as I broke out into the boardwalk, the corpses disappeared and the voices faded. A ship lingered 3 piers away, 3-masted and square of sail. Whale oil lamps burnt orange through its portholes. A short queue of sailors and passengers wound around the jetty and its bollards, all eager to escape the city. I made my way to the back of it and met the wary stares of the living waiting before me. One ghost stood among them, and that was all. "Psst," I called to the man in front of me. A swarthy man, lacking in teeth and hair. It looked as though he had taken twice the weathering any sailor ought to have received. "What?" He snuffled at me, wiping his grimy nose. He was immediately transfixed by the phantom. "Where's the ship going?" "Araxes, in the scatter." I smiled warmly at him, as warmly as any ghost can. "I have a few more bags just around the corner in my carriage. I'll give you a silver if you can help me aboard." The sailor thought about it for a moment. 4. 2. I stuck out my hand and he sneered. "Lead the way then," he said, spitting to the gutter. "But I better not lose my place." "We'll be quick." I beckoned him up the street, empty but for one lantern shining from a window. He grumbled all the way around the corner, where he soon found my hand around his throat. It was a gamble. With the code and tenets broken, my haunting had been in question. I could have laughed aloud as his flesh gave way before me. When I rejoined the line, my borrowed body sweating from the duel going on within us, I flashed a gap-toothed smile at the man in front, adjusted the sack on my back, and patted the phantom between his cold ears. For half an hour the line shuffled forwards until it was my turn at the foot of the gangplank. "Sailor?" asked a gruff man perched behind a makeshift desk. He was already writing the answer down with his reed. "No, passenger," I said, halting him. "And I want a private room, if there's one left." The man looked me up and down, then at the glowing dog at my side. The pouch of silver I'd lifted from a Araxes chambers convinced him, and he told me my room number in a mumble. Fighting the old and arthritic body up the gangplank, I found my room with ease, barging the door open with my backside and settling my sack on the bed. With stiff fingers I unfastened it and let the phantom push its head from his temporary lodgings. "Sorry about that, old chap. Don't think they quite understand you at the moment." The ghost hound whined at me, flicking his ears back and forth. I ruffled their faint edges for good measure and got to my feet. As I moved to peek out the porthole, I felt a queasy rumble in my stomach. I knew the culprit of that sensation well enough. Salt meat stew. Deciding to find a place to ditch the man overboard, I went to the door. The phantom moved to follow, but I made him stay by patting him on the nose. He growled at me but lay down. Outside, in the ship's sweaty corridors, I tried to find my bearings again, remembering which way I'd come amidships. I chose a direction, and I'd barely taken 2 steps before a door swung open before me, and an old, pale woman in fur-trimmed boots and a blue velvet coat bustled out of it. "Out of my way, ugly peasant! How dare you lurk outside my door? Away with you!" She ordered me, her shrill voice and skull accent piercing my borrowed ears. I could have laughed right in her wrinkled face. Of all the ships leaving Araxes on this chosen evening, my old nemesis had chosen the same one. I pulled myself aside before her lanky guard could push me out of the way, and moved on. I heard her complaints as she worked her way down the corridor away from me. "And I am never coming to this accursed city again. Oh, the Araxes face when I opened the chest. I shall never forget the day. And with this battle, What a frightful, horrid place. I long to see the black beaches of Skull. I paused, in the shadows along from her door, waiting for her voice to fade. I bit my lip with a snaggletooth, pondering when my stomach gurgled again. As I brought my lockpicks from where I'd stashed them in the sailor's grimy pockets, a smile lit my face. It was only fitting, I thought, as I swiftly broke the lock of her door, that she should arrive home as she had arrived in Araxes. I was already shuffling my trews down before I closed the door.
The end. We hope you have enjoyed this production of Breaking Chaos by Ben Galle, narrated by Maura Quirk and Samuel Rukin, members of SAG-AFTRA. Recorded books are available wherever audiobooks are sold, including audible.com, audiobooks.com, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and in public libraries through RB Digital. Thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.